The dust comes first, a red smear tearing across empty Arizona country that hides nothing and forgives less. She breaks the cedar at a dead sprint, barefoot, a hide bundle crushed to her ribs. Three riders crest the ridge behind her, horses already white with foam. A man kneels at his fence, wire in his glove. He does not look up. Sound lies. Dust does not. She skids 10 feet from him, chest heaving, eyes that will not beg. He holds out his only reins. She sees the loose shoe, the rider's clothes. She swings up. Arizona Territory, 1887. The dust came first. Before the girl, before the hoofbeats even. Just a smear of red rising off the flat, the kind of dust that means something is running for its life. This was country that didn't forgive carelessness. 400 acres of scrub and rock and stubborn grass, hemmed in on the east by a line of broken hills that turned purple at dusk, cut through in the middle by a creek that ran only half the year and pretended, the rest of it, that it had never run at all. A man learned this land the way he learned a difficult horse slowly, with respect, understanding that the ground would hurt you the moment you stopped paying attention to it. Walt Cordell had spent 15 years learning it, knew which rises held water even in a dry August, which hollows turned to mud after the first hard rain, which stretch of fence needed checking twice a week because the wire there had a habit of working itself loose no matter how many times he tightened it. Walt Cordell didn't look up right away. He was down on one knee at that very stretch of fence line, pliers in his fist, wire biting into his glove. 43 years old, and every one of those years was written into his hands. He'd learned a long time ago not to jump at sound. Sound lies. Dust doesn't. So when he finally raised his head, he already knew. Somebody was running, and somebody else was chasing. She came around the cedar break at a dead sprint, barefoot, a hide bundle clutched to her ribs like it was the only thing left in the world worth holding on to. 18, maybe. Black hair whipping loose behind her. And her eyes, Walt would think about those eyes for the rest of his life, though he didn't know that yet, standing there with Weisher in his hand and his heart doing something it hadn't done in 16 years. The land out here didn't hide much. That was the thing about this stretch of Arizona flat scrub for a mile in any direction, broken only by the low cedar break she'd come tearing around, and beyond that nothing but heat, shimmer, and sky. A man could see trouble coming from a long way off. He could also see it catch someone, because there was nowhere in that flat country for a running person to disappear to, not fast enough, not against horses. She skidded to a stop 10 feet from him, chest heaving. Behind her, over her shoulder, three riders broke the ridgeline, coming hard, coming fast enough that their horses were foaming already, coming the way men come when the chase itself has stopped being about the chase and started being about pride. Walt's whole body went through something in the space of about 2 seconds that he would spend a long time afterward trying to name. First, the old cold clarity, the soldier's clarity, counting distance and speed the way he used to count it before an engagement called 90 seconds, before those riders closed the gap, maybe less. Then something underneath that, something that had nothing to do with soldiering at all, because he looked at her face, at the particular exhausted defiance in it, and some part of him that he'd kept buried under 15 years of silence sat straight up and said, plain as anything, help her. He didn't consciously decide. That was the strangest part of it, the part he'd turn over for weeks after. There wasn't a moment where he weighed the cost and chose to pay it. His hand was already moving toward Copper's reins before the thought had even finished forming. Walt didn't ask her name, didn't ask what she'd done, who she was, why three armed men wanted her badly enough to run their animals half to death across his land. There wasn't time for questions. And even if there had been time, he wouldn't have asked anyway. That wasn't who he was. Not anymore. He held out the reins, no words, just the reins, and his hand steady as a fence post, and his old mare Copper shifting her weight, like she already understood the plan better than he did. The girl looked at the horse, looked at him, and for one terrible second Walt thought she might refuse, might think it was a trap, because why would a stranger, a white man, alone, no gun on his hip, simply hand over his only horse to a runner he'd never met? Except she didn't refuse. She stepped forward, put her hand flat against Copper's neck, and her eyes went somewhere else for a moment, checking, reading the animal the way some men read a room. Left front shoe, she said. Her English was careful, clipped, like she'd practiced it in her head long before she ever needed it. It's loose. Walt blinked. Of all the things, dust behind her, death behind her, maybe. And she was telling him about horseshoes. He didn't answer. Couldn't, really. Just nodded. The way a man nods when the world has stopped making sense. And nodding is the only response left that doesn't require thinking. She swung up into the saddle in one motion, smooth as water finding the low ground, adjusted the bundle under her arm, and for a heartbeat just one, she looked back at him. Not thank you, not goodbye. Something else. Something that felt like recognition, though they had never met, though he hadn't had a reason to be recognized by anyone in a very long time. Then she turned copper east, off the trail, into the broken country of rock and brush, where three men on tired horses would have a hard time following. And she was gone. Walt stood in the middle of the empty trail. No horse, no gun. Just a man and a fence and a coil of wire he'd forgotten he was even holding. The three riders arrived a minute later, their mounts blown, sides heaving, lathered white at the flanks. The lead rider had a red bandana knotted at his throat, and eyes that moved too fast, cataloging everything the empty trail, the man standing on it, the fresh hoofprints veering east into the rocks. You see a girl come through here? No greeting. Just the question, thrown down like a challenge. Walt looked up at him. Didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Been standing here 5 minutes, he said. Haven't seen much of anything. The lie came out smooth, the way a soldier's lie comes out smooth, because Walt Cordell had spent 4 years of his life learning how to hold still under fire, how to keep his voice level when everything inside him was screaming, and a calm lie always sounds more like truth than the truth itself does. The rider's eyes cut to the tracks. Fresh. Clear. Pointed east. Those your tracks? Could be. The man's jaw worked. His hand drifted toward his belt. Slow. Testing. Walt didn't move. Didn't so much as shift his weight. Because here is a thing nobody ever tells you about a man who has already lost everything he was ever afraid to lose. He is not brave. He is only done being afraid. And the two things look identical from a distance. Only up close can you tell the difference. And by then it is usually too late to matter. The rider saw it. Saw something in Walt's stillness that didn't add up to a rancher standing on his own land, minding his own business. His eyes flicked, just once, to the coil of wire and the pliers still resting near the fence post, as if trying to decide whether they belonged to a simple man or a dangerous one, and finding, in Walt's face, no easy answer either way. You got a name, the rider said, less a question than a demand. Cordell, Walt said. This is my fence you're sitting your horses on top of, if it matters to you. It seemed for a moment that it might matter. The rider's jaw worked again, and one of the men behind him shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward a rifle scabbard, and Walt understood with total clarity that the next several seconds could go any number of ways, none of them entirely within his control. And the arithmetic in the lead man's head chase a stranger, maybe start something that costs more than it's worth. Over a girl who was already gone didn't come out in his favor. Let's move, he said to the others, and they wheeled east, at a different angle than the girl had taken, and rode off into the heat shimmer without another word. Walt stood there a long while after the dust settled, hands loose at his sides. And then, because his hands had started to shake, and he needed to know why, he looked down at them. Not fear. He knew what fear felt like in his own body, had known it plenty once a long time ago, in places with names he tried not to say out loud even now. This was something else, something that felt almost like waking up, which was strange, because Walt Cordell had not felt awake in 16 years. For one flickering moment, standing there in the heat with his empty hands trembling, an old memory surfaced without permission. A river crossing somewhere in Tennessee, a boy from his unit named Beaufort, who couldn't have been older than 19, going down under fire and water that turned red faster than seemed possible, and Walt, 21 years old, himself, doing nothing, because doing something would have meant dying alongside him for no good reason at all. He had told himself in the years since that he had made the correct calculation that day, the soldier's calculation: live to fight again. He had never once told himself it hadn't cost him something to make it. There had been another memory too, one he trusted more, because it had taught him something useful instead of something merely painful. A ridge outside a town whose name he'd deliberately let himself forget, where his unit had been ordered to hold a line against a force twice their number, and Walt, barely more than a boy himself then, had spent the better part of a night reading the ground by starlight, finding the places where cover ran thin, the angles where a man could see far and be seen very little. They had held that ridge until morning. Nobody on his side had died who didn't have to. It was the one clean memory he carried out of 4 years of war, the one piece of that time he'd never had cause to regret, and some part of him, standing on his own empty trail with his hands still shaking, understood that the same cold, patient way of reading ground had just quietly saved a stranger's life. He shook the memory off the way he'd learned to shake off most things, picked his tools up off the ground, set out walking, 4 miles home, under an Arizona sun that didn't care one bit about a man's feelings. The first mile passed easy enough, his boots finding the familiar ruts of a trail he'd walked or ridden 1,000 times before, his mind still turning over the girl, the riders, the strange calm that had settled over him in the middle of what should have been a frightening encounter. By the second mile, his mouth had gone dry, and the heat had started working its particular patient cruelty on him, the kind that didn't announce itself all at once, but simply accumulated, mile by mile, until a man's thoughts narrowed down to the plainest, smallest things. By the third mile, he'd stopped thinking about the girl almost entirely, and started thinking only about water, and shade, and the particular stubborn ache that comes from a body doing something it hadn't planned on doing that morning. He passed the old line shack that marked the halfway point of his land, empty and half collapsed, unused since before Mary's time, and paused there just long enough to rest in what little shade its leaning walls still offered. He would think of that same shack again month later, under circumstances he could not have imagined, standing there that afternoon, sweating and thirsty, and entirely unaware of what the coming weeks held. But underneath the thirst, underneath the sun, underneath the long empty road, something else was moving in him. Something small. Something that had been dead so long he no longer had a name left for it. It felt, God help him, like hope. To understand why a man would hand his only horse to a stranger and walk 4 miles home without complaint, you have to understand what 16 years of silence does to a person. Walt Cordell had not always been a quiet man. Older folks around the valley, the ones who'd been here long enough to remember, the postmaster's wife, the man who ran the feed store, would tell you if you asked that there had once been a version of Walt Cordell who laughed, who sang while he worked, badly, off-key, and didn't care who heard him doing it, who used to ride 4 miles into town just to buy his wife a length of blue ribbon because she'd mentioned once, only once, that she liked the color. That man had a name. Mary. Mary Cordell, 22 years old the year she married him, standing in a homemade blue dress in front of the cabin Walt had built with his own hands, 2 years fresh out of the war and still learning how to be a person again instead of a soldier. He'd built the cabin himself, that first year home, before he'd even properly met Mary, working through a long cold winter with timber cut from the eastern hills and hauled down by mule, one load at a time. He hadn't had a clear reason for it back then, building a home for a family he didn't yet have with a woman he hadn't yet met. He'd told himself at the time that it was simply something to do with his hands that wasn't fighting, something that built instead of destroyed, and maybe that had even been true. But some part of him, looking back on it later, understood that he had been building it for her, before he knew her name. The way a man sometimes prepares for a good thing arriving in his life well before he has any right to expect it, because that's what Walt had been before the ranch. A soldier, 4 years in a Union cavalry saddle, riding through smoke that stayed in your lungs for weeks after, learning things about the human body and the human heart that no young man should have to learn before the age of 25. He came home from that war the way a lot of men came home from it, hollowed out in places nobody could see, quiet in a way that made people nervous, and grateful, so grateful, for something as simple and stupid and beautiful as a woman who looked at him like he wasn't broken. Mary never once looked at him like he was broken. He'd met her at a church social in the first cold spring after the war, standing near a table of pies he had no appetite for, and she had walked straight up to him, not shy, not careful, the way most people were careful around men, just back from the fighting, and asked him plainly which pie he'd recommend, since he clearly wasn't planning to eat any of them. He'd told her he didn't know. She'd told him that was the single most useless answer she'd ever received to a simple question, and something in the dry humor of it had cracked something loose in his chest that he hadn't felt move in over a year. He'd taken his time working up to asking her, longer than he should have, because some stubborn, wounded part of him kept insisting a man who'd seen what he'd seen in the war had no business dragging a good woman into a life with him. Mary had settled the question herself in the end, the way she settled most things plainly, without much patience for a man's overthinking. She'd found him mending a fence one Sunday afternoon, months into their courting, and told him flatly that she'd marry him whenever he got around to asking properly, and that she'd appreciate it happening before the year was out, since she wasn't getting any younger, and neither, Lord knew, was he. He'd asked her that same evening, down on one knee in the dirt outside her father's house, feeling more foolish and more certain than he had ever felt about anything in his whole life. She'd said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. They married 18 months later, on a bright cold morning with half the valley in attendance. Mary in the blue dress she'd sewn herself because she said she'd rather wear something made by her own two hands than something bought with somebody else's, and Walt in the one good coat he owned, standing in front of the cabin he'd built with timber he'd cut and hauled himself over the course of a hard, hopeful winter, 4 years together after that. 4 years of mornings on the porch, 4 years of her laugh carrying across the yard while she hung wash, 4 years of Walt coming in from the fields to find her, waiting with coffee and a look on her face that undid every hard thing the war had put in him. And then October of 1871. The baby came early, too early, a boy, and they'd already picked the name Daniel, after Walt's own father and the midwife did everything a midwife knew how to do, and none of it was enough. And by morning Walt Cordell had a wife and a son, and neither one of them drew breath anymore. Sometimes it just happens, the midwife told him, wringing her hands like the words might come out gentler if she worked them enough. Sometimes babies aren't meant for this world. Walt had nodded. Because what else do you do when someone says something that's stupid to you? What else is there? You nod, and you thank her for trying, and you carry your wife's body to the hill behind the cabin, under the cottonwood tree, and you dig 2 graves instead of 1, and you lay them down in a cradle you spent 2 months building with your own hands for a child who never once got to sleep in it. 2 names on 2 stones. 1 date. No scripture. Walt didn't have any words left over for scripture. After that, he stopped talking much. Stopped planning for any future beyond the next day's fence line, the next season's cattle, the next sunrise that came whether he wanted it to or not. He told himself it was safer this way. Better to work than to feel. Better to know every post on 400 acres than to know the shape of your own grief, because the fence posts didn't ask anything of you, and the grief always did. Amos Pruitt showed up about 6 months after the funeral, a drifter passing through, good with horses, good with cattle, good most important of all, as far as Walt was concerned back then with silence. He never asked about the photograph on the table by the window, never asked why Walt walked past it every single morning without once looking directly at it, though he always knew exactly where it was. Amos hadn't known Walt before the tragedy, had never seen the laughing version of him the old-timers in town still talked about sometimes. He only ever knew the man who was left over afterward, and he seemed to have made his peace with that a long time before Walt ever did. The photograph itself had survived by accident more than intention. Mary's sister had sent it from back east 2 years into the marriage, a formal little portrait taken at a studio during a visit nobody had expected Mary to make, and it had sat on the table by the window ever since, through the wedding and the pregnancy and the funeral and every gray, identical morning that followed. Walt had considered, more than once in those early terrible months, simply putting it away in a drawer somewhere, the way a man puts away a wound he doesn't want to keep touching. He never had. Some stubborn part of him had insisted the photograph stay exactly where it was, in plain sight, even if he could never quite bring himself to look at it directly. It became over the years less a keepsake than a fixed point in the room, the way a compass needle stays fixed regardless of whether anyone consults it. He always knew where it was. That, for a long time, had been enough. It was only in the days after the girl on the trail that he noticed himself glancing toward it more often than the old careful habit allowed. Not looking away quite so fast, letting his eyes rest on Mary's face a half-second longer each morning, as if some door long sealed had begun, without his express permission, to loosen on its hinges. Amos stayed, worked, became, over the 15 years since, something closer to family than either man would ever have said out loud. 15 years was a long stretch of a man's life to spend beside someone, watching from the outside a grief he could never fully enter, and Amos had done it without complaint, without prying, without once suggesting that Walt owed him an explanation for any of it. Dale Sutter arrived more recently, 2 seasons back, younger 25 maybe, And he talked more than Amos did, smiled more too, which for reasons Walt couldn't fully explain, made him trust the man less rather than more. There was a watchfulness in Dale, a way of measuring a room, a person, a situation, like he was always calculating an angle nobody else could see. Walt kept him on because the ranch needed the extra hands. But he watched Dale the way you watch a horse you aren't sure is broken yet. Amos had his own reasons for silence, though it took Walt the better part of 5 years to learn even the shape of them. A wife back east, once, a farm that failed. A brother who died owing money to men who didn't forgive debts kindly, and a long guilty drift west afterward that Amos never described as running, though everyone who heard the story understood it as exactly that. He'd told Walt the whole of it only once. One bad winter night with the wind howling through gaps in the old barn roof they hadn't yet fixed, and neither man had ever brought it up again. That was how the two of them operated. Say the hard thing exactly once, out loud, and then let it rest, unspoken but not forgotten, for as long as it needed to rest. It made for a quiet ranch, a quiet, functional, entirely bearable kind of life up before dawn. Coffee black because sugar was for men who still cared about small pleasures. Cattle checked, fence mended, supper eaten in a silence that had long since stopped feeling uncomfortable to either of them. Some men would have called it lonely. Walt had stopped thinking of it that way years back. He'd simply called it manageable. And manageable had been enough, because manageable didn't ask anything of him he wasn't willing to give. 16 years. That's how long Walt Cordell had spent building a life designed to never again require anything of him that he couldn't afford to lose. No debts. No friendships worth the name beyond Amos, who had earned his slowly, one silent year at a time. No feelings that reached past the surface of a day's work. He had made himself deliberately, and with great discipline, into a man who could not be hurt again. And it had worked. Right up until the moment a girl with a hide bundle and dark, fearless eyes ran across his fence line, and something in him, something he thought had died in October of 1871, sat up and took notice. The walk home took just under 2 hours. Amos was at the gate when Walt finally came up the last stretch of road, and the older man's face went from mild curiosity to something close to alarm. The second he saw his employer arriving on foot, sunburnt, hatless, no horse in sight. "Lord," Amos said, already moving toward him. "Walt." Walt let Amos steer him to the water trough. Drank, splashed his face. Drank again. "Lent her out," Walt said, finally. Amos went still. "You what?" "Lent her out. To who?" Walt looked at his own hands, at the dust caked into the creases of his palms. "Somebody who needed her more than I did this morning." There was a long pause. The kind of pause that, between two men who'd known each other 15 years, said more than words ever could. Amos studied him. Looked for something, a joke maybe, or a fever, or some other explanation that made more sense than the plain one sitting right in front of him. He didn't find one. "All right," Amos said at last, and that was all he said, because that was Amos. He didn't push where pushing wasn't wanted. He did, however, glance once more at Walt's sunburnt face, at the dust caked thick on his boots, at the particular unfamiliar lightness, sitting oddly on a man who usually carried himself like his own shadow, was too heavy a burden to bother lifting. "You look different," Amos said, almost against his own will, as if the observation had escaped him before he could decide whether to make it. "Different how?" "Don't rightly know." Amos scratched at his jaw, considering. Like something woke up that's been asleep a good while. Walt didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure he wanted one yet, either. He simply nodded, took the reins Amos offered, and let the matter drop, though the older man's words followed him the rest of that day like a burr caught in a sock, small and persistent and impossible to fully ignore. That, for the moment, was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it. Not really. That evening, once the chores were done, and the light had gone long and gold across the yard, Walt did something he hadn't done in longer than he cared to admit. He walked up the hill behind the cabin, past the cottonwood tree, to the two stones sitting quiet in the grass. He didn't say much. He never did. Up there, just stood a while with his hat in his hands, looking at Mary's name and Daniel's name cut into the same pale stone, the dates that never changed no matter how many years piled up on top of them. "Did something strange today," he said finally, to the stones, to the wind, to whatever version of Mary might still be listening. Somewhere he couldn't see. "Gave away copper to a girl I never met. Don't rightly know why." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, the way it always did, and offered him nothing back but the sound of it, which was, he supposed, about as much of an answer as he had any right to expect. He stood there until the light went from gold to gray, and then he walked back down the hill, and something about the walk down felt different than the walk up had, lighter somehow, as if saying the thing out loud, even to two silent stones, had loosened something that had been sitting tight in his chest all day. Over the following days, something in Walt Cordell began, quietly and without his permission, to change. He noticed it first in small things. The way morning light came over the eastern ridge gold, then white, then that particular hard Arizona brightness, and how, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he actually watched it happen, instead of simply enduring it. The way the fence line felt different under his hands. Not just wire and wood anymore, but something he was choosing to maintain, rather than merely failing to abandon. The way he found himself, twice in 3 days, humming some tuneless scrap of a song he hadn't hummed since Fee died, and stopping himself both times, startled, like he'd caught himself doing something illegal. The next morning, he and Amos worked the north pasture together, checking a stretch of fence that had gone slack over the winter, and for a good while, neither man said much of anything, which suited them both fine. It was Dale, drifting over from where he'd been mending a gate hinge nearby, who broke the quiet. Folks in town saying a girl ran through here. A few days back, Dale said, leaning on the fence post, with the particular casualness of a man who has rehearsed his casualness beforehand. A patchy girl. Being chased. That's so, Walt said, not looking up from the wire in his hands. Word travels fast for a valley, this empty. Dale's eyes stayed on him a beat too long. You wouldn't know anything about that, wouldn't I? Amos, a few feet down the fence line, kept working without looking up either, though Walt caught the faint, deliberate stillness in the older man's shoulders, the particular quality of a man listening very closely while appearing to do the opposite. Dale let it go, eventually, with an easy laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, and wandered back toward the gate hinge. And Walt watched him go, turning the whole brief exchange over in his mind, the way he turned over most things that didn't sit quite right. Wanted to hear it from you direct, Amos said quietly, once Dale was well out of earshot. Not asking you why, just noting it. Noted, Walt said. They said nothing further on the subject that day. But Walt found himself, over the following hours, watching Dale with a fraction more attention than he'd spent on the man in the 2 seasons prior, and not liking, particularly, anything new that attention turned up. He rode into town on the second day for supplies he didn't strictly need yet, mostly, he admitted to himself somewhere around the 2nd mile, because staying at the ranch with his own thoughts had started to feel restless in a way it hadn't in years. The general store was its usual slow midweek self, the storekeeper's wife sorting mail behind the counter, 2 ranch hands from a neighboring spread arguing lazily about the price of nails. You hear Crane's men were out past the Hollis place again? One of them was saying, not troubling to keep his voice down. Walt's ears caught on it before his mind fully placed the name, not Crane. He'd misheard. The name, when the storekeeper's wife corrected it a moment later without even looking up from her sorting, was Vane. Silas Vane. Man's bought half this valley in 3 years, she said, mostly to herself, sliding letters into their proper slots, bought or otherwise. Depends who you ask and whether they're still around to be asked. Walt paid for his supplies and rode home turning that over, though at the time it was only a name, a rumor, the kind of talk that drifted through every small town about every man with more money than his neighbors. He had no way of knowing yet how much that name was about to mean to him. Dale asked about copper once the day after Walt returned from town, in that easy, over-friendly way of his that always made the back of Walt's neck prickle a little. Lent her out, Walt said. Same answer he'd given Amos. Dale's eyebrows went up. Lent her to who, exactly? Didn't ask her name? You lent your only good mare to a stranger and you didn't even ask her name? Walt met his eyes, held them. That's about the size of it. Dale looked at him a long moment, something calculating behind his easy smile, and then he shrugged and let it go. Though Walt noticed because Walt noticed most things, it was one of the few habits the war had left him that actually served him well, that Dale mentioned the horse again, quietly, to nobody in particular, 3 more times over the following week. Once while mucking stalls, once while they ate supper in near silence, the way they usually did. Once, strangest of all, standing at the south fence line, for no reason Walt could readily identify, looking east toward the broken country where the girl had disappeared. Walt didn't think much of it at the time. He had other things occupying his mind, namely, a pair of dark, level, fearless eyes that kept surfacing in his thoughts at inconvenient hours while he was mending fence, while he was checking cattle, while he was lying awake at 2 in the morning, listening to the particular silence of a house that had been too quiet for 16 years, and was only now, for reasons he couldn't articulate, starting to feel like it was waiting for something. He told himself it was nothing, just curiosity. A man wonders about a stranger he helped. That's natural, that's human. That doesn't mean anything, except it kept not going away, which should have told him something. And eventually it did. He made a second trip into town that same week, an errand that could easily have waited, and found the mood there had shifted since his last visit, subtle but unmistakable, the way weather shifts before you can name exactly what's coming. A family he half recognized was loading a wagon outside the feed store, moving with the particular hurried carefulness of people who don't want to be seen leaving town in a hurry, even though that's exactly what they're doing. Walt didn't know their name yet, wouldn't for months. But he watched the man help his wife up onto the wagon seat, watched him not look back at whatever house or land they were leaving behind. And something about the whole scene sat wrong in Walt's chest for the rest of the ride home. At the livery, the stable hand, a boy of maybe 15, who talked more than his employer probably wanted him to mention, unprompted, that 2 more families out past the eastern grazing land had sold up quiet in the last month. Good money too, they say. Nobody complaining exactly. Just going. The boy said it with the particular blankness of someone repeating a thing he didn't fully understand, and Walt, listening, felt the same blankness settle over him, because none of it added up cleanly, and things that didn't add up cleanly in this country usually meant somebody was working hard to keep them that way. He rode home slower than the errand required, the way a man rides when his mind has gotten ahead of his horse. On the morning of the 4th day, Walt walked out before sunrise to feed the horses and stopped cold at the gate. Copper was standing there, patient, waiting, like she'd been waiting all night and hadn't minded one bit. Walt approached slowly, the way you'd approach anything that felt too good to be entirely believable. He ran his hand along her neck, warm, solid, real, but different too. Her coat had been brushed out until it shone in the weak gray light, her mane worked free of every tangle, her hooves clean and freshly trimmed, and the shoes. All 4 reset. Professional work. Careful work. The kind of work that takes time nobody owes you. Tied to the saddle horn was a small bundle, wrapped in cured hide. Walt's hands were not steady when he untied it. He would think about that later, how strange it was, that his hands had been steady enough to face down 3 armed riders 4 days earlier, and now shook over nothing more than a bundle of hide and string. Inside, a strip of dried venison, a handful of piñon nuts, and a length of beadwork, blue and white, threaded onto a leather cord, the pattern intricate and precise, hundreds of tiny beads worked into a design that took his breath a little, though he couldn't have said exactly why. He held it up to the weak gray light of not quite dawn, and turned it over slowly in his fingers. It was beautiful. That much he understood right away, the way anyone understands beauty even without understanding craft. But there was something else in it too. A pattern within the pattern. Small marks worked into the border that didn't quite match the rhythm of the rest, that felt less like decoration and more like something meant to be noticed, someday by the right eyes when it mattered. Walt didn't have those eyes. Not yet. He only knew, standing there in the half-dark with his hand closing slowly around a stranger's gift, that someone had spent hours, maybe days, making this. That the venison and the nuts were practical, a traveler's plain thanks, easy enough to understand. But the beadwork was something else entirely. The beadwork was a message he did not yet know how to read. He carried it inside, set it on the table, next to the photograph of Mary in her blue dress. Blue and white beads beside a blue homemade dress. He looked at both a long while, standing in the gray morning light of a cabin that had held its breath for 16 years. It struck him, standing there, that he hadn't received a gift, a real one, chosen and made for him specifically in longer than he could easily place. Mary used to give him small things constantly, the way some people simply couldn't help doing. A pressed flower folded into a letter. A shirt button re-sewn tighter than it needed to be, just so he'd notice the extra care in it. Once, a length of blue ribbon he'd bought her, that she'd cut a piece from and tied quietly around his hat brim without asking, saying only that a man ought to carry a little color with him even out working fence all day. He still had that hat. Still had, somewhere in a drawer he didn't open often, the frayed remnant of ribbon that had eventually worn through and fallen off during some ordinary chore years back. He had not thought about that ribbon in a long while. He thought about it now, looking at the blue and white beads catching the gray morning light, and something in his chest ached in a way that felt, strangely, less like reopening an old wound, and more like being reminded that the wound had, once, been attached to something worth having. Then he went back out to the barn, put his hand on Copper's neck, and stood there thinking about gifts given and gifts returned, and about the strange, wordless language two strangers had somehow managed to speak to each other across a trail full of danger, without ever once exchanging a name. The rest of that day passed strangely for him. He found himself pausing at odd moments, mid-chore, to turn the whole encounter over again in his mind, hunting for some detail he might have missed the first dozen times through it. The particular steadiness in her voice even at a dead run. The care she'd taken to reset every shoe on the horse rather than simply the loose one, as though half a job wasn't worth the doing. The venison and the nuts, practical and plain, sitting alongside beadwork that clearly represented hours of a skill most men would never in their lives possess. He caught himself once, standing at the fence line with a coil of wire forgotten in his hands, simply looking east toward the broken country where she'd disappeared, as if the land itself might eventually offer up an answer to a question he hadn't fully worked out how to ask. Amos found him like that, called his name twice before Walt heard him, and said nothing about it beyond a raised eyebrow that communicated more than words would have. It was, Walt understood distantly, the first time in 16 years that his mind had wandered somewhere other than grief or work without his express permission. 2 days later, a rider appeared coming in from the east. Not hiding, not hurrying, just riding, easy and open, in full daylight, the way a man rides when he has business to conduct and no reason to sneak about doing it. Walt was at the corral, working a young gelding on a lead line, when he saw the rider approaching. Young 20, maybe sitting a pinto mare with the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime in the saddle rather than a season or two of practice. The young man stopped at the gate, waited, didn't dismount until Walt had set down his rope and crossed the yard to meet him. "You are the man from the trail," the rider said. His English was careful, deliberate, each word placed like a stone across a creek. "I am," Walt said. "My name is Kestrel." A pause, brief but weighted. "I was sent to speak with you." Walt studied him a moment, young, serious. Something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he'd been chosen for this particular errand and knew it, and took the weight of that seriously. "Come in," Walt said. "I'll put on coffee." The cabin was small. One room, simply kept. Kestrel didn't look around it the way most visitors didn't take stock of the photograph on the table, the beadwork lying beside it, the general spare quiet of a man who had built his life to need very little. He simply sat where Walt indicated, accepted the coffee when it was offered, and waited until Walt had settled across from him before he began. "The woman you helped," Kestrel said. "Her name is Nahi." Walt turned the word over silently. "Nahi. She is the daughter of our headman," Kestrel continued. Something clicked into place in Walt's mind. Headman's daughter. That explained a great deal, the urgency of the chase, the particular fury in the riders' faces, the sense that this had never been a small or ordinary thing. "The men who followed her," Walt said. "Not quite a question. They were sent by a man named Silas Vane." Kestrel's voice hardened slightly on the name, the way a man's voice hardens around something he has learned to hate through long, patient acquaintance. "He has been buying land in this valley for 2 years. Or taking it." "Taking," Walt repeated. "Threats. Fires nobody can ever prove were set. Wells that go bad the same week a man refuses to sell." Kestrel let each item land plainly, without embellishment, the way a man reads a list he has memorized because the memorizing itself matters to him. "You know this name." Walt did. Silas Vane had appeared in the territory about 3 years back, trailing money from somewhere east, and in that time had come to hold 3 ranches that once belonged to other men. The Boone place Boone had sold, or said he had, and left in the dead of night without so much as a farewell to his nearest neighbors. The Hargrove Ranch Hargrove had held on 12 years, before something scared him bad enough to run. And the Salas place, where old man Salas had died in what everyone called a hunting accident. and his widow had sold to Vane not 2 weeks later. Nobody could prove a thing. Everybody knew anyway. It was, Walt realized now, exactly the kind of talk he'd half-heard at the general store 2 days back and let slide past him as simple gossip, not yet understanding it would soon be the whole shape of his life. "I know who Vane is," Walt said quietly. Kestrel leaned forward slightly. "He wants the corridor between your land and our summer grounds. He needs both to control the water." Walt understood that immediately, the way any man who had spent his whole life on dry country understood it. Water wasn't a resource out here. Water was the whole game. Whoever held the water held everything downstream of it, which in this valley meant holding everyone. "Why are you telling me this?" Walt asked. Kestrel considered the question with real care before answering. "Because I asked our headman to let me." And because he said he paused, searching for the right shape of the English words, "A man who gives freely, expecting nothing back, is a man worth warning." He was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, and then, as if deciding the rest of it was owed as well, he went on. "My people have summered in the high country east of here, longer than either of our nations has kept a written record of it," Kestrel said. "Your government drew lines on paper 20 years back. Some of those lines cut straight through land my grandfather's grandfather knew by name, every spring and every rock in it. We learned to live around the lines, learned which agents could be trusted and which couldn't, which years brought soldiers and which years brought only surveyors." A faint, humorless twist of his mouth. "Vane is neither soldier nor surveyor. He is something new. A man who uses paper the way other men use rifles. Walt, turn that over, and your headman still agreed to help me. A stranger. White, because the corridor runs through your land as much as ours," Kestrel said simply. "And because Nahi told him what kind of man handed her his only horse and asked for nothing." He met Walt's eyes steadily. "My people do not extend trust cheaply, Cordell. When we do, it is because we have already looked hard for a reason not to, and failed to find one." Something moved in Walt's chest at that. A physical sensation, almost like a door swinging open somewhere it hadn't opened in a very long time. The specific feeling of being seen and understood by someone who owed him absolutely nothing. "There's more," Walt said. Not a question this time either. "Yes." Kestrel's eyes met his directly. "Vane's men have been watching your ranch. The same men from the trail. 2 nights this week on your south ridge." He let that sit a moment. "They are not watching to learn your habits, Cordell. They already know your habits. They are counting your men, your horses, your guns, your weaknesses." Walt felt the old cavalry instinct rise in him, cold and clear and useful, the part of him that had spent 4 years learning to think in terms of positions and numbers, and the arithmetic of who could outlast whom. "Our headman believes," Kestrel finished, "that they intend to move within the week to drive you out, the way they drove out the others." Walt stood, walked to the window, looked out at 400 acres of land he had built, with his own 2 hands, out of nothing but grief and stubbornness. Land that held his wife and his son under a cottonwood tree on the hill. Land that some stranger, with Easternson, now believed he could simply take. "There's more," he said again, turning back from the window. Kestrel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, our headman does not send only a warning. He chose his next words with visible care. He offers help." The words landed in the small, quiet room like something enormous. "The corridor Vane wants," Kestrel went on. "Your land is part of it. If he takes your ranch, our people lose access to the Eastern Springs. We share an enemy, Cordell. What threatens you threatens us also." Walt looked at this young man, a stranger, an emissary, offering him something he had not had in 16 years of careful, deliberate solitude. Partnership. Alliance. The terrifying, unfamiliar weight of being needed by someone, and needing them back. "Tell your headman," Walt said slowly. "I want to speak with him." Kestrel nodded once, finished his coffee, rose. At the door he stopped and turned back. "Nahi asked me to tell you something," he said. Walt waited. "She wanted you to know." The loose shoe was reset. A brief, unreadable look crossed Kestrel's face. "She said you would understand." Walt turned the message over, and something in his own curiosity got the better of his usual reserve. "What is she like?" he asked. "Your headman's daughter." Beyond noticing horseshoes, Kestrel considered the question longer than Walt expected. "Stubborn," he said finally, something almost fond creeping into his careful English. "Raised mostly by her grandmother, who taught her more about this land than most men learn in a lifetime. She argues with her father more than any of his other children ever dared, and he listens to her more than he'd admit to anyone but himself. A pause. She noticed the shoe on your horse, while 3 armed men were closing the distance behind her. I have known her whole life, Cordell, and even I am not entirely sure how she manages to notice things like that in moments like that. She simply does. Sounds like a woman worth knowing, Walt said, before he'd quite decided to say it out loud. Something flickered across Kestrel's face, amusement maybe, or simple recognition of a thing he'd already half suspected. He didn't comment on it, just nodded once, finished the last of his coffee, and rose. And then he was gone, mounted, riding east into the brightening morning, and Walt stood in his own doorway a long while, thinking about a young woman who had noticed a horseshoe while running for her life, and about how badly, suddenly, foolishly, he wanted to meet her properly, not as a stranger on a trail, as a person as herself. He stood a long while in that doorway, turning the whole matter over with the same careful deliberation he'd once given to questions of far greater consequence: where to make camp, which fords were safe to cross, which orders were worth the risk of questioning. An alliance with Chogan's people meant declaring himself, publicly and permanently, on one side of a fight that half the valley would rather he stayed out of entirely. It meant risking the fragile, careful peace he'd built his whole solitary life around. It meant, in the plainest terms, choosing to be seen again, after 16 years of deliberate invisibility, and Walt understood well enough by now that visibility and safety had never once, in his own experience, traveled together. And yet, he found himself, weighing all of it honestly, unable to locate within himself any genuine desire to choose the other path. Not because the danger didn't frighten him, it did, plainly, the same cold, clean fear he remembered from years of soldiering, but because the alternative, the safe and invisible and entirely alone alternative, no longer felt like safety at all. It felt but increasingly like the very thing that had been slowly killing him for 16 years, dressed up in the comfortable language of caution. For the first time since October of 1871, Walt Cordell wanted something that reached beyond simple survival. He wanted to live. The days that followed moved with a strange double rhythm, ordinary on the surface, urgent underneath. Cattle still needed tending. Fence still needed mending. But every task now carried a second, quieter weight, the sense of a clock running somewhere just out of sight. Walt told Amos everything that evening, sitting on the porch with coffee going cold between them, the sky doing its long, slow burn from gold to violet to black. Amos listened without interrupting, which was Amos's particular gift, and when Walt finished, he was quiet a moment before he spoke. "You believe him, the young one?" "I believe him. Vane's men on our ridge, watching us." Amos turned that over slowly, the way he turned over most things, weighing it from several sides before setting it down. "That explains Miller's dog." Walt looked at him. "What about Miller's dog?" "Been barking 3 nights running, out past the south fence." "I figured coyote." Amos's jaw tightened. "Didn't figure men." They sat with that a while. The particular silence of 2 men realizing, together, that a danger they'd only half believed was real had in fact already been standing at their door. "And Dale?" Amos asked eventually, careful, testing the question the way a man tests ice. Walt didn't answer right away. He'd been turning that same question over himself, quietly, for days now, the way Dale kept circling back to the subject of the horse, the watchfulness under his easy smile, the sense of a man always calculating an angle nobody else could see. "I don't know about Dale," Walt admitted finally. "Not yet. You want me to keep an eye." "I want you to keep both eyes," Walt said, and something almost like a smile crossed Amos's weathered face, the first in longer than either of them could easily remember. "You remember how he came to us," Amos said after a moment, more thoughtful now. "Showed up right when we needed the extra hands worst, during calving season. Good with a rope, good with the cattle, even now, whatever else might be true about him." "I remember. Man doesn't have to be bad at his work to be bad for you," Amos said. "Learned that the hard way once myself a long time back. Just means whatever else he's doing it well enough that you don't see it until it's already cost you something." Walt turned that over, feeling the truth of it settle uncomfortably in his chest. He'd hired Dale on the strength of steady hands and a willingness to work long hours without complaint, and had told himself, back then, that a man's quiet ambitions weren't any of his business so long as the fences got mended and the cattle got fed. He was beginning to suspect that assumption had been a mistake, though he couldn't yet have said how large a one. Keep both eyes, Walt said again, quieter this time, and Amos nodded once, and that was the end of that particular conversation, though neither man forgot it in the days that followed. Supper that evening was quieter than usual, which was saying something, since quiet had always been the baseline state of the Cordell table. Amos ate steadily, methodically, the way he did everything. Dale picked at his plate with less appetite than usual, glancing up now and then at Walt with an expression that seemed to be searching for something without quite committing to asking for it outright. "You've been out at that south fence a lot this week," Dale said eventually, to no one in particular, though the question was plainly aimed at Walt. "Fence needs checking," Walt said. "Same fence you checked yesterday. Fences have a habit of needing checking twice." Walt kept his voice level, unbothered, though something in him had gone quietly alert the moment Dale raised the subject. "You've got an opinion about my fences, Dale." "No opinion," Dale said, too quickly, and returned his attention to his plate. Amos said nothing through the entire exchange, though Walt caught the older man's eyes flick once toward Dale and stay there a beat, longer than idle curiosity required. After supper, once Dale had gone off to the bunkhouse, Amos lingered at the table a moment longer than usual. "He's asking about the south fence because that's where the ridge sits," Amos said quietly. "Where those riders would have watched from if Kestrel's telling it straight." "I noticed," Walt said. "Didn't figure you hadn't." Amos rose, collected the plates, and paused at the door. "Just wanted to say it out loud. Sometimes a thing needs saying out loud before a man lets himself fully believe it." Walt sat with that a while after Amos had gone, the cabin settling into its familiar evening stillness around him, and found that he did in fact believe it. Had believed it for days, if he was honest with himself. He simply hadn't wanted to be the one to say it first. 2 days later, the headman's answer came, not through Kestrel this time, but through a change in the land itself. Walt was on the porch near evening, coffee in hand, watching the light go long and gold across the valley, when Amos came from the barn at a pace faster than his usual unhurried walk. "You got company," Amos said. "East Ridge." Walt looked, and there, along the high line where his land met the broken country beyond, a row of riders sat their horses, still as the rock beneath them. 5, then 7, then more. A silent line stretched across the ridge, watching the ranch below with the patient stillness of men who had all the time in the world and intended to use every bit of it. "Their people?" Walt asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer. "Has to be," Amos said quietly. "Nobody else sits a horse still that long without a reason." Walt set his coffee down. His hand drifted, instinctively, toward where his rifle leaned inside the door, and then stopped. Because reaching for a gun right now, in front of men who had come simply to watch, would be its own kind of message. The wrong one. "Let's wait," Walt said. Amos nodded, settled into position on the porch steps, rifle across his knees but not raised, not aimed, just present. And they waited. 2 men on a porch, a silent line of riders on a distant ridge, and between them 400 acres of darkening land that both sides, for entirely different reasons, had decided was worth protecting. The light kept its long, slow burn. Gold to orange, orange to red. From this distance, the riders on the ridge looked less like men than like a row of carved figures set deliberately against the sky, unmoving, patient in a way that unsettled Walt more than open hostility would have. He found himself counting them without meaning to, the old soldier's habit surfacing again. 9 he made it, maybe 10. Hard to say for certain with the light playing tricks along the ridgeline. None of them carried anything raised or aimed. They simply sat their horses and watched, and the watching itself felt like its own kind of language, one Walt understood he was only beginning to learn how to read. Red to purple, and then to a deep, star-scattered black. And when the last color finally drained out of the sky, the riders on the ridge were simply gone. Not retreated, not driven off, just gone. The way something disappears when it has finished saying what it came to say. Walt sat a long while afterward in the dark, thinking. It was a message, plainly. He just didn't yet know exactly what it said. A warning, maybe. Or a kind of vigil. Or, and this thought arrived slower, quieter, but didn't leave once it had arrived, an honor. A silent acknowledgement, offered the way some people can only offer things, without a single word spoken, that a debt existed, and that it had not been forgotten. It was only much later that night, doing one final round of the barn before turning in, lantern held low against the dark, that Walt noticed Dale's horse was gone from its stall. He stood there a long moment, In the flickering lantern light, hand resting on the empty rail, feeling something cold and careful settle into his chest, the particular familiar coldness of a soldier realizing, a half-second too late, that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. The straw in the stall was still faintly warm where the horse had recently stood. Not an hour gone, maybe less. Which meant Dale had waited, deliberately, until the riders on the ridge had finished their silent vigil and vanished, before slipping away himself under cover of the same darkness that had swallowed them. That timing troubled Walt more than the disappearance itself. A man running from a decision he regretted didn't usually wait for a war party to clear the ridge first. A man reporting to someone might. Dale had said nothing about riding out. Left no note, no word for Amos, no explanation offered to anyone. Just an empty stall, and hoofprints in the yard, dust pointing south, toward a direction that had nothing to do with any errand Walt had ever sent him on. Walt stood there a long while, turning that over, the same slow, careful way Amos turned things over, weighing it from every side he could find. He thought about the riders who had watched them from the ridge, still and patient. He thought about a girl named Nahi and a length of beadwork with a pattern folded inside its pattern, waiting for eyes that knew how to read it. He thought about Silas Vane, a name he'd only just learned, and never once had reason to fear, until now. And underneath all of that, quieter than the rest, ran a thought he wasn't yet ready to look at directly. Because caring about anything again, a piece of land, an alliance, a stranger's dark, unreadable eyes meant opening a door he'd spent 16 years, bolted shut behind. It meant risking exactly the kind of loss that had hollowed him out once already, and nearly kept him hollow forever. Some nights, lying awake in the dark, he had almost convinced himself that the hollowness was safer, that a man who wanted nothing could lose nothing. He was beginning to suspect, uncomfortably, that this had never actually been true, that a man who wanted nothing had simply already lost everything, and called the losing safety, because the alternative was admitting how much it had cost him. He didn't have an answer for that yet, only the thought itself, sitting heavy in his chest alongside everything else the day had handed him. He thought, too, about the particular shape of the last several days, how quickly an ordinary life could tilt sideways into something else entirely. A week ago, his biggest concern had been a loose stretch of wire on the south fence. Now he was weighing an alliance with a headman he'd never met, watching his own hired hand for signs of betrayal, and, turning over again and again, the memory of a girl's steady voice telling him about a horseshoe, while death closed in behind her. A week ago, he would not have believed any of it, told from the outside about a stranger's life. Now it was simply his own, and he found, turning it all over one final time in the dark barn, that he did not particularly want it back the way it had been, and he thought, finally, about 16 years spent building a life that needed nothing, and no one, a fortress made of silence and habit, and careful, deliberate distance, and how, in the space of a single week, without his permission and very much against his better judgment, that fortress had begun, all on its own, to come apart. Somewhere out past the dark tree line, an owl called once and went quiet. Walt stood a long moment more in the barn doorway, and something in him, some old careful voice built out of 16 years of practiced distance, tried once more to argue the other side of things. Send word to Kestrel that the alliance is off. Sell to Vane after all, quietly, and take whatever money the man offered, and go somewhere flat and forgettable, where none of this ever has to touch you again. It would have been easy enough, in a way. He had no children left to protect this land for, no wife left to disappoint if he simply let it go. Except the thought didn't sit right the moment he actually let himself finish it. Because this land held Mary and Daniel under that cottonwood tree, and a man does not sell the ground his family is buried in to escape a fight he is only afraid of losing. And because somewhere out east, a girl with fearless eyes had trusted a stranger with her life on the strength of nothing but a look, and Walt found, turning the whole matter over one final time in the dark, that he did not particularly want to be the kind of man who let that trust go unanswered. Walt closed the barn door, latched it, and walked back toward the house under a sky gone thick with stars, carrying with him the growing unshakable certainty that whatever was coming for this valley, for Nahi's people, for Vane's ambition, for the ground his wife and son were buried in, was coming soon. And that this time, for the first time in 16 years, he did not intend to simply stand still and let it happen to him. He thought of Mary once more before he finally slept that night, Not with the old crushing weight the memory usually carried, but with something gentler, almost companionable, as if she were simply sitting with him a while in the dark the way she used to, listening without judgment while he worked through a hard decision out loud. He did not know, lying there, what the coming weeks would cost him, or what they might eventually give back in return. He only knew, with a certainty that had been entirely absent from his life for 16 long years, that he was no longer willing to spend whatever time remained to him standing perfectly still. He intended to be ready. Dale's stall stayed empty for 3 days. Walt checked it every morning. Out of habit, or maybe out of something else. Because a man doesn't check an empty stall 3 mornings running just out of habit. He checks it because some part of him is still hoping the horse walks back in, and the hand who took it walks in, right behind with some ordinary excuse, some boring reason that makes all this worry look foolish. It didn't happen. So on the 4th morning, Walt stopped checking. And that, more than anything, told him how he really felt about it. "You think he ran to Vane?" Amos said. Not a question. They were mending tack in the barn doorway, the kind of work that let a man's hands stay busy while his mind went somewhere else entirely. "I think," Walt said slowly. "I don't know what I think yet. That's not like you. None of this is like me." Amos almost smiled at that. Almost. Because it was true, and they both knew it, and there wasn't much left to say about it that hadn't already been said in the silence between them. Walt found himself, over those 3 days, running through every interaction he'd had with Dale, since the man arrived 2 seasons back, hunting for signs he might have missed. The easy questions about pay that had seemed, at the time, like ordinary curiosity. The way Dale always seemed to know exactly when Walt planned to ride into town, though Walt couldn't now recall ever having told him directly. Small things. The kind of small things a man only notices once he's already been given a reason to look for them, and which feel, in hindsight, obvious enough to make him feel foolish for having missed them the first time around. "You can't blame yourself for not seeing it," Amos said, apparently reading some of that self-recrimination in Walt's face. "Man who's good at deception is good precisely because decent folks don't expect it of him. That's not a failure on your part. That's just how deception works. Doesn't make it sit easier," Walt admitted. "No," Amos agreed. "Reckon it doesn't." They worked in that silence a while, longer, needle and all, and the particular smell of leather oil filling the space between them before Amos spoke again. "Man doesn't just vanish clean like that without somewhere to vanish to," he said. "Wherever he went, somebody was expecting him." "Figure the same," Walt said. "Question is whether he went running from something or running to report something." Amos set down the strap he'd been working, considered it a moment. Different kind of man, depending on which. Walt didn't have an answer for that yet. It sat between them, unresolved, the way most things involving Dale had started to sit lately, half a question with no clean answer waiting on the other side of it. Nahi came back on the 6th day. She rode in with Kestrel again, but this time she came straight to Walt instead of waiting by the horses, and something in the directness of it made his chest do a strange, unfamiliar thing, like a held breath finally letting go. "You look tired," she said, no greeting first. Straight to it, the way she seemed to do most things. "Rancher's disease," Walt said. "Goes around this time of year." "That's not a real disease." "No," Walt admitted. "It's not." She studied him a moment, those dark, unreadable eyes doing their particular work, reading him the way she'd read his horse on the trail that first day. And whatever she found there, she didn't push on it. "Not yet. My father wants to meet you properly," she said instead, "at the Dry Creek. Tomorrow, at first light. I'll be there." "Good." A pause, then almost like an afterthought, though Walt suspected nothing Nahi said was ever really an afterthought. "Copper missed you, I think, while you were separated." "She say so?" Horses don't need words. Nahi's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. "You should learn that too." She glanced past him then, toward the barn, toward the empty stall she couldn't have known about, but somehow seemed to sense anyway, the way she seemed to sense most things. "Something's wrong here," she said. Not a question either. Walt considered lying. Decided against it, mostly because he suspected she'd see through it anyway. "One of my hands rode off 6 nights back. Haven't heard from him since." "The one who watched you too closely," Nahi said. Kestrel mentioned him. "That's the one." She was quiet a moment, something calculating behind her eyes now, an echo of the same watchfulness Walt had noticed in her that first day on the trail. "My father will want to know this," she said. Before tomorrow, if possible. Tell him, Walt said. Tell him everything. I've got nothing left to hide from a man willing to help me. Something warm flickered across Nahi's face at that, gone as quickly as it appeared. That's a rare thing to hear from a man in this valley, she said. And then she was gone again, back east with Kestrel, leaving Walt standing at the gate with that half-smile still working its way loose somewhere behind his ribs, uninvited, unstoppable, and entirely new. The dry creek bed at dawn looked exactly as it had the first time cracked earth, pale light, the particular hush of a landscape that hadn't decided yet whether the day was going to be kind. Chogan was already there when Walt arrived. Older than Walt had pictured somehow, though he couldn't have said why he'd pictured anything different. 60, maybe. Silver threading through dark hair, a face carved by weather and grief in roughly equal measure, and eyes that carried the specific weight of a man who had buried more than his share and kept walking anyway. Kestrel stood a few paces back, ready to translate, though something in the way Chogan watched Walt approach suggested translation might not be entirely necessary for the parts that mattered most. They stood 10 feet apart. Neither man moved first. Because this was a test Walt understood, not of strength, not of anything so simple. A test of patience, of whether a man could hold still long enough to be measured honestly. Chogan spoke first. Kestrel translated, careful with each word. He says, "You gave something freely to someone you did not know." A pause exact. He asks if you understood what it would cost you. Walt considered the question honestly before he answered. That felt important. Answering honestly. Not entirely, he said. I understood it was a risk. I didn't know yet how much of one. Kestrel translated. Chogan listened, nodded slowly the way a man nods when an answer confirms something he'd already suspected. He spoke again, longer this time. He says, a man who does the right thing knowing it's a risk is worth more than a man who waits until the risk is gone. Kestrel paused, choosing the next words with care. He says many men wait for the risk to be gone. It never is. Something settled in Walt's chest at that. Recognition, maybe. The sense of being understood by a man who had every reason not to bother understanding him at all. He's right about that, Walt said quietly. They talked for the better part of an hour after that. About Vane. About the men watching from the South Ridge 8 riders. Chogan said, 2 of them soldiers once. You could tell by the way they sat a horse, trained different from cowboys, trained to kill efficient and quiet. About the law in town, and how little of it could be trusted. And about water always, underneath everything, about water, because in this country water was the only currency that never lost its value. Chogan asked, at one point, about the beadwork, and Walt described it as best he could, the blue and white pattern, the marks in the border that felt like more than decoration. Something shifted in the old man's expression at that description, some private recognition Walt couldn't fully read, though Kestrel's translation of Chogan's response was maddeningly brief. He says his mother-in-law made things like that once, Kestrel said, things that carried more meaning than they appeared to. Walt waited for more. None came. Chogan had moved on already, back to the matter of Vane's men and the South Ridge, and Walt filed the moment away without understanding yet how much it would eventually matter. What about the sheriff, Walt asked. Purdy, any use to us there? Chogan's expression went dark before Kestrel had even finished translating the question. He spoke at length. Kestrel's voice, when it came, was careful and flat, the way a man's voice goes flat when he's repeating something ugly because it needs repeating, he says. The sheriff is Vane's man bought 2 years back. When Boone's well went bad, we saw riders that night, told the sheriff what we saw. A pause. The sheriff said we were lying. Walt felt something cold settle into him. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion he'd been carrying without quite admitting he carried it. So we're on our own, Walt said. Yes, Kestrel said, and did not soften it. We are on our own. Walt looked at Chogan, made a decision quiet and complete, the kind a man makes only once he's stopped weighing it and simply accepted it as fact. Tell him the truth of what I have, Walt said to Kestrel. I have 2 hands, had 2. One's loyal, 15 years loyal. The other rode off 6 nights back, and I don't know where he went or who he's talking to. He paused. I have ammunition for maybe 3 days if we're careful. 30 head of cattle, not enough to matter to anyone but me. No friends in town. No debts either, which used to feel like safety and now just feels like being alone. Kestrel translated it all, slow and exact. Chogan listened without moving, his face giving nothing away until the very end. when something in his eyes shifted, softened, just slightly. The way stone softens, which is to say barely at all, but enough that you notice. He spoke. He says, "You have spent years trying to disappear," Kestrel translated. "To be left alone." A pause waited. He says Vane does not leave anyone alone. Sometimes the only way to protect what is yours is to stand up and be seen. Walt felt that land heavy, the way true things sometimes do. "Tell him I think he's right," Walt said. Chogan nodded once, spoke again, and this time something in his voice carried forward motion, decision rather than assessment. "He will send warriors," Kestrel said. 3. To help prepare your defense. To watch the South Ridge. To have your eyes where you cannot see." "I'm grateful," Walt said. Chogan held up a hand before Kestrel had finished translating that. Spoke sharply, briefly. "He says do not be grateful yet," Kestrel translated. "This alliance will cost us both. When the white men in town learn you work with us, they will turn on you. When our own people learn we protect a white man's ranch, some will question it too." A final pause, heavier than the rest. He says the cost of this alliance is real, but the cost of standing alone against Vane is worse. Walt understood that completely. Had understood it if he was honest. From the very first moment he'd held out his reins to a stranger on a dusty trail and decided, without quite, that some costs were worth paying. "I accept the cost," Walt said. Chogan smiled then. Small, brief, but entirely real, the first true warmth Walt had seen cross the older man's face. He stepped forward, held out his hand. Walt took it. The grip was firm, brief. No further words needed, because some agreements don't require them. They only require two men willing to hold still long enough to make them. They lingered a while longer at the creek bed. After the formal part of the meeting was done, the tension easing into something almost companionable. Chogan asked, through Kestrel, about the ranch, about the cattle, about how long Walt had worked this particular stretch of land. And Walt found himself answering more openly than he'd expected to, describing the fence lines and the water sources and the particular stubbornness of the soil on the western acreage. "He says you know this land the way a man knows his own body," Kestrel translated at one point. Something like approval in the old man's voice it came through. "Every ache, every old injury," Walt admitted, "took years. He says that is the only way worth knowing anything." Kestrel finished, and Chogan nodded once, satisfied, as though the answer had confirmed something he'd needed confirming before he could fully commit his people to this fight. Chogan spoke once more before they parted, more slowly this time, choosing his words with evident care even filtered through Kestrel's translation. "He says his own grandfather remembers when this valley had no fences at all," Kestrel said. "No deeds. No lines drawn on paper by men who had never once walked the ground they claimed to own. He says he does not tell you this to shame you, Cordell, or to suggest the land was not also, eventually, rightfully yours. He says only that a man who remembers the land, existed before his own claim to it, tends to hold that claim differently than a man who believes the land began the day his own deed was signed." Walt considered that a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere he hadn't expected it to reach. "I'll try to remember that," he said finally, and meant it. Chogan seemed satisfied with the answer, whatever its imperfections, and the two men parted with a final nod that carried more warmth than the formal handshake from earlier had managed. Amos found the truth about Dale 2 days later, and it landed harder than either of them expected. He'd ridden into the trading post at the edge of the valley on an errand for salt and rope, and, while he was there, an old acquaintance, a freighter who moved goods between the territory's scattered outposts, mentioned, offhand, that he'd seen Dale Sutter riding with two of Vane's men. Weeks back, before the chase on the trail, before Nahi, before any of it, Amos rode home faster than the errand required. Before, Walt repeated when Amos told him, standing in the barn doorway with rope still coiled loose in his hand. "You're sure?" Before Nahi. "Freighters known me 8 years, no reason to lie about it." Amos's jaw was tight. "Which means Dale wasn't a hand who turned traitor when things got hard, Walt. He was Vane's man from the start. Planted here, watching us, long before that girl ever set foot on your fence line." Walt let that settle, because it changed the whole shape of things, didn't it? He'd assumed, everyone had assumed, that Vane's interest in this ranch began the day Walt handed Nahi his horse, that the chase on the trail was the spark that lit everything after it, except it wasn't the spark. It was just the moment the fire, already burning quietly for God knew how long, finally showed itself. So he's known everything, Walt said slowly. Our numbers, our guns, the layout of this whole place. For months. Looks that way. Then why hasn't Vane moved already? If he's had the information this long. Amos didn't have an answer for that, neither did Walt. Not yet. It sat between them, ugly and unresolved. The particular kind of question that keeps a man up long past when he ought to be sleeping. They turned it over from every angle they could think of that evening. Sitting on the porch, with the light fading gold to gray around them. Maybe Vane had been waiting for a better opportunity. Maybe he'd been occupied elsewhere, tightening his grip on some other corner of the valley before turning his full attention here. Or maybe, Amos suggested quietly, the wait had simply been patience, the particular, calculated patience of a man who preferred to let a target grow comfortable before striking, the same way a good hunter let game settle before taking the shot. That last theory sat the worst with Walt of all of them, though he couldn't entirely say why. Something about the idea of having been watched, unknowingly, comfortable and unsuspecting, for months on end, while a man out past the ridge waited for the precise right moment to close his hand around everything Walt had spent 15 years building. Nahi's visits kept coming, 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, each one longer than the last, and Walt found himself helplessly, foolishly, gratefully looking forward to them the way he hadn't looked forward to much of anything in 16 years. They walked the land together. She taught him things he should have known after 15 years working this same ground, and somehow never had. How to read the plants for water sage growing thick meant something underground, roots finding what the surface couldn't show. How to tell weather 3 days out just from the way the wind moved through the cedar. How to walk quiet enough that the land itself stopped noticing you. You've lived here 15 years, she told him once, crouched at the edge of the dry creek, her hand flat against the cracked earth. And you never once asked the ground what it wanted to tell you. Didn't know it was talking. Everything is talking. She looked up at him, that same level, unreadable gaze from the trail, softened now by something warmer. You just stopped listening, a long time before I met you, I think. Walt didn't answer that right away. Because she wasn't wrong, and there wasn't much comfort in arguing with something true. 16 years, he said finally. I know. She said it simply. No pity in it, which he was grateful for, because pity was the one thing he couldn't have stomached. Kestrel asked about you in town, before my father agreed to help. He learned about your wife. Something in Walt went very still. I'm sorry, Nahi said, for your loss. I'm sorry for yours, Walt said, because Kestrel had mentioned it too, once, in passing that Nahi's mother had died the same way Mary had, in childbirth years back, and that Nahi had been raised instead by her grandmother, who'd taught her everything she now knew about plants and water and horses and the particular quiet language of the land. I don't remember her, Nahi said. I was too young. She was quiet a moment, looking out at the valley. But my grandmother told me something, before she died too. She said pain doesn't disappear. It only changes shape. A pause. Careful, deliberate. She said you don't forget. You don't move on, not really. You learn to carry it. You make room for it, without letting it take up all the space you have. Walt stood very still, feeling those words land somewhere deep and old inside him, somewhere he'd kept sealed off for 16 years out of pure necessity. She was right, he said quietly. Yes, Nye said. She was. They stood there a while longer in the dry creek bed under a vast, indifferent sky, 2 people who had each lost more than their share, understanding each other, without needing very many words to do it. And when they finally walked back toward the gate, something had shifted between them, subtle, unspoken, but real, the way weather shifts before a storm even reaches you, the air itself already different. Her first visit that week came on an afternoon when Walt was in a foul mood he couldn't entirely explain, worn thin from 3 straight days of drilling positions with the Warriors and turning Chog Hogan's revelation about Vane's father over and over in his mind without arriving anywhere useful. Nahi found him at the corral, jaw tight, working a young horse harder than the animal probably needed. That horse hasn't done anything to deserve that, she said, watching him a moment before speaking. Walt eased up, embarrassed, though he tried not to show it. Rough few days, I heard, about your hand, she said it plainly, without the careful delicacy most people used around grief, which Walt had come to appreciate about her more than he'd expected to. Kestrel told me his name. Dale. That's him. You're angry at him. I don't rightly know what I am at him, Walt admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. Angry. Worried. Feel like a fool for not seeing it sooner. Nahi considered that, leaning against the corral rail beside him. My grandmother used to say a man who trusts easily isn't a fool. He's simply choosing to believe the best is possible, even knowing it sometimes isn't. She said the fools are the ones who stop trusting entirely because they mistake caution for wisdom. She glanced at him sideways. You gave a stranger your horse without asking her name. That's not the behavior of a man who stopped trusting. Whatever this Dale did with that trust doesn't undo the fact that you still have it to give. Walt turned that over a long moment, feeling something in his chest loosen slightly, the tight, angry knot of the last 3 days easing just a fraction. You always have an answer ready like that? Not always, a small, genuine smile. Just for the things that matter. On her second visit that week, Nahi brought Walt out to a stretch of rocky ground near the eastern boundary he'd walked 100 times without ever once stopping to look at it closely. She crouched, brushed dust from a shallow depression in the rock, and showed him the faint remains of old grinding marks worn into the stone by hands generations gone. My grandmother's grandmother ground corn here, she said, before any fence existed, before any of this was anyone's property at all, the way your law understands property. Walt crouched beside her, running his own fingers over the worn stone. Feels strange, he admitted, owning ground that was already lived on so long before me. It should feel strange, Nahi said, not unkindly. Most men who hold paper for land never once stop to feel that. You're already ahead of most of them just by noticing. I'll come back, Nahi said at the gate, mounting her horse, if you want to learn more. I want you to, Walt said, and it came out too fast, too eager, and he heard himself say it, and felt something close to panic, because when was the last time he'd wanted anything out loud, said it plain like that, without armor around it? Except he only smiled. Small, warm. Before she rode off that afternoon, Walt found himself wanting, for the first time, to offer her something in return for everything she'd taught him. I don't know much about reading plants or wind, he admitted, but I do know cattle. And horses, better than most. If there's ever use in that for your people, it's yours. Nahi considered him a moment, something thoughtful crossing her face. My father's herd has struggled the last 2 winters, she said slowly, losing more calves than we should. Perhaps you would look at them sometime. See what a rancher's eye finds that we've missed. I'd be glad to, Walt said, and meant it, feeling something unfamiliar and pleasant settle into his chest at the thought of being useful to her, the way she'd been useful to him. Then it's agreed, she said, and there was something almost formal in the way she said it, like a small treaty freshly signed between 2 people who had, without quite planning it, become something more than strangers helping each other survive a shared danger, and rode east without another word, leaving Walt standing at the gate feeling, for the second time in as many weeks, dangerously, thrillingly alive. It was on her 3rd visit, weeks into their strange, careful friendship, that Chogan sent word he wanted to speak with Walt again. Alone, this time. No Kestrel to translate because, as it turned out, Chogan's English was better than he'd ever let on, and there were some things, he said through Kestrel just once more to make the arrangement clear, that a man preferred to say himself. They met again at the dry creek bed. Chogan came without warriors this time, just an old man and a younger one, standing on cracked earth in the cooling evening light. There is something you should know, Chogan said. His English was slow, deliberate, but entirely clear, before this goes further. About Vane. Walt waited. His father, Chogan said, came to this valley before you did. Before your wife's family did too. Something in Walt went very still at that. My wife's family, her father held land here. Water rights, on the eastern branch of the creek. Before you ever met her. Chogan's eyes held Walt's, steady, careful. Vane's father wanted those rights. Tried to take them, the way his son tries now. Threats. Pressure. A fire that burned a barn one summer that nobody could ever prove was set. Walt felt something cold moving through him. Slow and creeping, like water finding the low ground of a story he thought he already knew the whole shape of. Her father held on. Chogan continued. With help from my father and from other families in this valley who stood together rather than sell separately, Vane's father left the territory bitter. Spent years afterward chasing other ventures, other land, trying to rebuild what he'd lost here and never quite managing it. His son grew up hearing that story at every supper table, I imagine. A grievance passed down like an inheritance, heavier than any actual money the old man left behind. Walt stood there a long moment, the pieces reordering themselves in his mind with a slow, sickening clarity. This was never just about the corridor, he said slowly. Never just about controlling water for its own sake. No, Chogan said. For Vane, this is also an old debt. A grudge 2 generations deep. And there is more. Walt waited, some part of him already bracing for whatever came next. I have heard through men who trade in the towns east of here that Vane had a son of his own, Chogan said. Grew sick and died some years back, while his father was away chasing land deals in another territory, trying to recover the fortune his own father had lost. Vane was not there when the boy died. Some men, carrying a grief like that, bury it. Others turn it into fuel. His eyes held Walt's, grave and steady. I believe Vane has spent every year since telling himself that if he had simply finished what his father started here, if he had simply won this valley, the way his father had failed to, none of it would have cost him what it cost him. He has built himself a story where taking your land undoes his own son's death. It does not, of course, but grief rarely listens to reason, and a man convinced his suffering has a solution is a far more dangerous man than one who has simply given up hope of finding one. Walt looked out at the darkening valley, at land his wife's family had once fought to keep, land he had inherited without ever fully understanding what it had cost to hold on to in the first place, and felt the whole shape of Vane's obsession settle into place with an awful, coherent logic. Not 2 separate wounds. One wound passed father to son, twisted by loss into something that could never actually be healed by acquiring more ground, more water, more control, but which Vane had convinced himself, over years of grief and ambition tangled past separating, absolutely could. She never told me, Walt said quietly, of Mary of the Water Rights, of a history he'd never once suspected he was living inside of. Not an accusation, just a fact, small and aching. Perhaps she didn't know all of it herself, Chogan said, not unkindly. Or perhaps she wanted you to have peace for as long as peace was possible. Walt didn't answer that. Couldn't really. He only stood there, feeling the weight of a story larger and older than his own grief settle over him, and understanding with sudden and complete clarity exactly why Silas Vane would not stop, could not stop. Not until this was finished, one way or the other, the way it should have finished a generation ago and never had. The 3 warriors arrived the next morning. Kestrel brought them in himself, riding at an easy pace that didn't match the seriousness of what they'd come to do. This is Talon, Kestrel said, indicating a tall man, maybe 25, a thin scar tracing one cheek. Our best scout. He sees what other men walk past. Talon nodded once, didn't speak, just studied Walt with the same careful measuring look Chogan had used at the creek bed. This is Grey Wolf. Shorter, built solid through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who spent more time with horses than with people. He reads an animal's mind better than most men read their own. Grey Wolf grunted something that might have been a greeting. And this is Otter, the youngest of the 3, maybe 18, eyes bright and a little nervous, glancing between Walt and the ranch buildings like he was measuring his own place in all of it. His first time working alongside your people. Be patient with him. Welcome, Walt said, and meant it. They spent the day walking every inch of the ranch. Walt, Amos, Kestrel, the 3 warriors. Talon found weaknesses Walt had walked past 1,000 times without ever truly seeing. This stretch of fence, a man could cut through in 30 seconds flat. Move the posts here instead, and it would take 5 full minutes, and 5 minutes, Talon said simply, is enough time to hear them coming. Grey Wolf examined the horses one by one and stopped at a rangy gelding favoring its right front. This one, he said. You don't see it yet. 3 days. He won't be able to run at all. Walt checked. Grey Wolf was right heat building, deep in the hoof, early, easy to miss if you weren't looking exactly the right way. Otter asked the practical questions. Nobody else thought to ask. How much ammunition? How many rifles? How much water stored? How much food? Walt answered honestly because there wasn't any version of this where dishonesty helped him. 3 rifles. Ammunition for maybe 4 careful days. Water enough for a week. Food longer than that. Good, Kestrel said when the accounting was done. Vane will try to starve you out or burn you out. We make certain neither one works. Talon spent a good part of the afternoon walking the property alone, disappearing for stretches at a time, and returning with observations Walt would never have arrived at on his own. The dry wash on the north side, he pointed out, ran deep enough in one stretch to hide 2 men lying flat, invisible from the house but with a clear line on anyone approaching from that direction. The old line shack near the eastern boundary, half collapsed and forgotten, could serve as a fallback position if the main house ever became untenable, though Talon noted grimly that a fallback position only mattered if the people using it survived long enough to reach it. Grey Wolf, meanwhile, took it upon himself to teach Amos and Walt both a handful of specific signals, a particular whistle that meant riders sighted, a different pattern that meant hold position, a third reserved only for retreat, used sparingly enough that everyone would recognize its gravity the moment they heard it. "A man who talks too much in a fight gets men killed," Grey Wolf said in his usual economy of words. "Learn to say much with little." Otter, for his part, spent an hour simply walking the fence line with Walt, asking question after question, with the particular hunger of a young man determined not to be the reason anything went wrong. How fast could a horse cover the distance from the south ridge to the house? Where did the moon rise this time of year? And how much light would it throw across the yard on a clear night? Walt found himself answering each question in turn, remembering what it had felt like to be that young and that earnest about staying alive long enough to matter, and something in him softened toward the boy in a way he hadn't expected. They worked until sundown, moving fence posts, reinforcing the barn doors, clearing sight lines from the porch, marking positions where a man could see far and be seen very little. Walt found himself falling back, without quite meaning to, into old habits from another lifetime, the particular clarity that came from thinking in terms of ground and cover, and the arithmetic of who could outlast whom. It felt strange to use those old skills again. Stranger still, how naturally they returned, as though 16 years of dormancy hadn't dulled them at all, only put them carefully away, waiting. That evening, around a small fire behind the barn where the three warriors had begun making their camp, Otter asked Walt, with the particular bluntness of the very young, whether he'd ever killed a man before. The fire crackled a moment before Walt answered. "In the war. Yes." "Does it get easier?" Otter asked. "The idea of it. Before it happens again?" "No," Walt said honestly. "It just gets more necessary sometimes than others. That's not the same as easier." Otter turned that over, seemed to find some use in it, and didn't ask anything further. Talon, sitting a little apart, watched the exchange without comment, though something in his expression suggested he approved of the honesty more than he would have approved of comfortable reassurance. It was 3 days after that when Walt learned the truth about Sheriff Purdy, and the timing could not have been worse. He'd ridden into town for supplies, flour, more ammunition than he wanted to explain buying, and stopped by the sheriff's office out of some half-formed hope that maybe, despite everything Chogan had told him, there was still a version of the law in this territory a man could actually lean on. Purdy was behind his desk, boots up, in no particular hurry to acknowledge him. "Heard you've been keeping strange company, Cordell," Purdy said, not looking up. "That's so. Apache riding onto your land, regular. Word travels. They're neighbors," Walt said evenly. "Same as anyone." Purdy finally looked up, and something in his expression made the hair on the back of Walt's neck rise, before his mind had even caught up with why. "Silas is a reasonable man," Purdy said. "You'd do well to remember that, before things get complicated for you." And there it was, the particular, unmistakable way, "Purdy," said Silas, easy and familiar, the way a man says the name of family, rather than the name of some rancher he happened to share a valley with. "You planning on doing your job at all, Sheriff?" Walt said, keeping his voice level, "or just delivering messages for him?" Purdy's boots came down off the desk slowly, deliberately, the easy posture gone in an instant. "Careful how you talk to a badge, Cordell." "Careful how a badge talks to a citizen," Walt said. "Seems only fair." For a moment neither man spoke, the small office thick, with a tension that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the particular stillness of two men who have both just recognized the other for exactly what he is. Purdy's hand rested near his own belt in a way that reminded Walt, uncomfortably, of the rider on the trail weeks back. The same testing posture, the same slow calculation of whether a threat was worth following through on. Then Purdy leaned back, the moment passing, though nothing about his expression had actually softened. "You're a stubborn man," he said. "Stubborn men in this valley don't tend to stay stubborn long. You'd do well to think on that." Walt didn't dignify it with an answer, just gathered his supplies and walked out, feeling the sheriff's eyes on his back the whole way to the door. Walt didn't say anything right then, just filed it away, the same careful, methodical way he'd learned to file dangerous information during the war. and walked out of that office with his supplies and a new sharp-edged certainty settling into his chest. He confirmed it that same afternoon, asking around at the general store with a casualness that cost him more effort than it should have. Purdy's wife, it turned out, was Vane's younger sister, married 11 years back, before Vane had ever set foot in this territory, back when Purdy was still just an ambitious young deputy in a town 3 counties over, which meant the badge in this valley had never once, not for a single day since Vane arrived, belonged to anyone but Vane himself. Walt rode home slower than usual that evening, turning the pieces over. Because now the shape of things was fully clear, no law to appeal to, no authority in this valley that wasn't already bought and folded into Vane's ambitions. Whatever came next, it would have to be handled entirely outside, whatever Purdy's badge pretended to represent. He told Amos and Kestrel both that evening, sitting around the small fire behind the barn where the 3 warriors had made their camp. "So it's just us," Amos said when Walt finished. "It's just us," Walt agreed. Otter, sitting closest to the fire, looked up with something like grim satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Simpler that way. Nobody to disappoint but ourselves." It was, Walt thought, the first thing the boy had said all week that made him almost laugh. The attack came 4 nights later. Walt heard it before he saw it, that particular quality of silence the desert gets right before something large starts moving through it. A hush so complete it practically has a sound of its own. He was already at the barn door, rifle in hand, when Amos appeared out of the dark. "South fence," Amos whispered. 8 riders. Maybe more. Talon materialized out of the shadows the way he seemed to specialize in doing, silent as smoke. "They spread out," he said, low and fast. 4 at the fence line. 2 moving toward the barn. 2 toward the house. "Positions," Walt said. They moved fast, practiced, now, from days of drilling, Amos to the root cellar, thick stone walls. Good cover, a clear line on the yard. Walt up into the barn loft, height and angle in his favor. Talon melted back into the dark, returning to where Gray Wolf and Otter waited on the ridgeline above, watching, waiting for the signal. The moon hung low and pale that night, throwing just enough light across the yard to turn everything the color of old bone. Walt could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, steady, counting down the way it used to count down in the moments before an engagement, and some part of him noted, almost distantly, that his hands weren't shaking anymore. Not since the war had he felt this particular quality of calm settle over him, the calm that came only once fear had done its worst work and simply run out of new places to go. The riders came slow at first, deliberate, carrying things Walt could just make out in the moonlight, cans of something, coiled rope, torches not yet lit. They meant to burn him out. What they didn't know, what they had absolutely no way of knowing, was that Walt Cordell had spent days preparing for exactly this. That there were eyes on 2 ridges besides his own. That the arithmetic they thought they understood had already, quietly, completely, changed. Walt stepped out of the barn into the open yard, made himself visible. "I know who sent you," he called out, his voice carrying flat and clear across the dark, sightless vein. The riders stopped, caught off guard by the sheer calm of it. "I know what he's done in this valley," Walt continued. "Boone Hargrove. Salis Fat." One of the riders found his voice, less certain than he probably wanted it to sound. "Then you know this is already done. Leave tonight or we burn it all." "Here's what you don't know," Walt said. He looked up toward the south ridge, toward the north. "Right now," he said, "there are people watching you from both directions. They know exactly where you're standing. They're waiting for my signal. You're bluffing," someone called back. Less certain than the first time. Walt didn't answer, just looked up and waited. A small fire bloomed on the south ridge. 3 seconds. Then dark again. The north ridge answered in kind. And from somewhere out east, a single clear note rose through the night air, long and carrying, the particular sound of a signal meant to be heard and understood by everyone within earshot. The horses felt it before the riders did, shifting, restless, sensing a threat their masters couldn't yet fully see. And that restlessness spread, the way fear always spreads through men on edge, until the riders were turning their mounts, slow at first, then fast, and then they were simply gone, riding south into the dark, leaving nothing behind but drifted dust and the particular silence of a fight that hadn't quite happened. Walt stood in the middle of his own yard a long while, watching the dark where they'd disappeared. Amos emerged from the root cellar. Talon dropped down from the ridge. "They'll come back," Talon said. "I know," Walt said. Next time, they won't come to burn, Talon said. They'll come to kill. I know that too, Walt said, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that the knowing didn't frighten him nearly as much as it should have. They had survived tonight. That mattered. Tomorrow's danger could wait its turn. Later, once the warriors had settled back into their camp and the yard had gone quiet again, Amos found Walt sitting on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, staring out at nothing in particular. 15 years I've known you, Amos said, easing himself down beside him. Never once seen you stand in the open and talk down armed men the way you did tonight. Didn't know I had it in me either, Walt admitted. Reckon it was always in you, just didn't have a reason to use it in a good while. Amos was quiet a moment, looking out at the same dark Walt was looking at. Man changes, he lets himself want something again. Makes him braver and more scared, both at once, seems like. That about sums it up, Walt said. They sat there a while longer in companionable silence. Two men who'd weathered plenty together over the years, though never anything quite like this, and something in the quiet felt different than their usual quiet. Less like two men simply enduring the same hard life, side by side, and more like two men who had just chosen, together, to fight for something worth keeping. Otter had taken a graze along his forearm during the exchange. Nothing serious, though. The boy wore the bandage, Kestrel, wrapped around it the following morning with an obvious pride that made Amos chuckle under his breath. First blood, Talon said dryly, watching the boy flex his arm and wince theatrically for anyone who happened to be looking. He'll tell that story for 30 years, and it'll grow into a bullet wound by the 10th telling. Will not, Otter said, though the grin on his face suggested he'd already begun rehearsing the exaggerated version. You did good work last night, Walt told him, and meant it. Held your position. Didn't panic when things got loud. Something in the boy's face shifted at that, the pride settling into something steadier, more earned. Grey Wolf taught me the signals, Otter said. Just did what he taught me. That's exactly the point of teaching, Grey, Wolf said, not looking up from the tack he was mending. So a man does the right thing without needing to think about it first. Walt watched the three of them a moment, Talon's dry humor, Grey Wolf's quiet competence, Otter's eager young pride, and felt something warm settle into the exhaustion still sitting heavy in his chest. Whatever else this fight cost him, it had also given him this, a handful of people, strangers not so long ago, who had bled a little on his behalf, and seemed somehow glad to have done it. Vane came himself 3 days later, not to fight, to talk. Walt was at the corral when he rode up, alone, or at least appearing to be well-dressed in a way that had nothing to do with ranch work, everything about him announcing money and the particular confidence money buys. Mr. Cordell, Vane said, dismounting, extending a hand Walt did not take. He withdrew it without visible offense, the smile never quite leaving his face. I thought we should talk. Man to man, your men tried to burn my ranch. Overzealous, Vane said smoothly. I've spoken to them, it won't happen again. Because you're here to make an offer instead, Walt said. Smart man. Something flickered behind Vane's eyes, not quite respect, but close to it. I'm prepared to offer you triple what this land is worth. Fair market value in cash. You could buy a bigger spread somewhere else, start fresh. No. Vane's smile thinned. You haven't heard the full offer yet. Don't need to. Walt held his gaze steady. This land isn't for sale. Vane studied him a long moment, the amusement draining slowly out of his expression. Something colder taking its place. I've looked into you, Vane said. Lost your wife, your son. 16 years ago. A pause, deliberate, cruel in its precision. That's a long time to be alone, Cordell. Walt's hands clenched at his sides. He said nothing. I understand loss, Vane went on. I lost a son too, different circumstances. Something flickered across his face, brief and unguarded, gone before it could properly be named. I was away when it happened, chasing something I told myself mattered more at the time. A pause, and when he continued, his voice had hardened back into its usual practiced smoothness, as if he'd caught himself revealing too much and moved quickly to cover it. I decided after that never to be weak again. Money is power. Land is power. I have both, and I'm offering you a chance to walk away from here, with your life still intact. Something in that brief, unguarded flicker told Walt more than the man likely intended it to. This wasn't only about a corridor of water rights, or even only about a grudge inherited from a bitter father. Somewhere underneath the money and the threat sat a man who had spent years chasing exactly this kind of victory instead of sitting at his own son's bedside, and who had never once, in all the years since, allowed himself to sit still long enough to feel the full weight of that choice. Some things aren't for sale, Walt said quietly. Everything is for sale. Vane's voice hardened. If the offer's high enough, then you can't afford this one. Something almost like genuine confusion crossed Vane's face for a moment, as if the response didn't fit the shape of any negotiation he'd conducted before. You'd rather die on this land than live comfortably somewhere else, he said, less a question than an attempt to understand a species of man he'd never before encountered. I'd rather live on this land, Walt said, than spend the rest of whatever years I've got left wondering if I sold out everything my wife's family fought to keep, just because a stranger offered me money to make the fighting stop. Vane's expression went entirely hard now, the pleasantness stripped away completely. I'm trying to be reasonable, he said. My patience has limits. Take the offer, or I will make you leave. I know what you did to Boone, Walt said. To Hargrove. To Salas. You know nothing. I know enough, Walt said, and soon everyone else will too. Vane stepped closer, the menace no longer hidden at all. You think your Apache friends frighten me? They don't. You think you can expose me? The sheriff, the judge, the land office. A pause, precise as a blade. You are one man, alone. I could have you killed tonight, and no one in this territory would ever question it. Walt met his eyes and did not look away, then do it, he said, quiet and level. They stood there a long moment, a test of wills neither man was willing to lose first, and it was Vane who, finally, stepping back with something like fury, barely contained behind his composure. You're a fool, he said. Maybe, Walt agreed, but I'm a fool with honor, which is more than you have. Vane's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out along it. He turned, mounted his horse without another word, and rode off, fast and hard, leaving nothing behind but dust and the certain, settling knowledge that whatever came next would not be another offer. Walt stood there a long while afterward, understanding fully, for the first time, exactly what he had chosen. There would be no turning back from this. Vane would come now with everything he had, and one way or another, before this was finished, someone in this valley was going to lose everything. Walt intended, with everything left in him, for that someone not to be him. The warning came 2 nights later, and it came from the last person Walt expected. He was checking the horses well past midnight, when he heard a horse moving slow through the dark, uneven, wrong somehow. Walt raised his rifle, moved toward the sound with his heart hammering, and found Dale Sutter slumped forward in the saddle, one hand pressed hard against his own side, blood soaked black through his shirt in the moonlight. Walt, Dale managed, voice thin and cracked. Walt, listen to me, Amos! Walt shouted, already moving, catching Dale as he slid sideways out of the saddle. Amos. Tomorrow night, Dale gasped as Walt eased him down onto the ground. They're coming tomorrow night. All of them. Every man Vane's got. His breath rattled wet in his chest. Not to burn this time, to finish it. Dale, I told them everything, Dale said, and something in his voice cracked open, raw and unguarded in a way Walt had never once heard from him. Months ago. Before the girl. Before any of it. I needed the money, Walt, and I told myself it didn't matter. Told myself you'd never even know. He coughed, and it came up red. Tonight I tried to leave. Tried to just ride away from all of it. They didn't like that idea much. Save your breath, Walt said, pressing his hand hard over the wound, feeling the warm blood slick against his palm. Amos, now! No time for that, Dale said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, the particular relief of a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying far too long. Listen, they know your positions. Every one of them, from before, but they don't know I warned you. That's the only edge you've got left, Walt. Use it. Why, Walt said, his voice rough, unsteady in a way it hadn't been in years. Why come back and tell me now? Dale's eyes found his in the dark, and for just a moment, all the easy calculation Walt had always distrusted in him was simply gone, stripped away, leaving only something plain and tired and human underneath. Because you gave a stranger your only horse, Dale said, and didn't ask her name first. A ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Figured it was time I did one decent thing too, before it was too late to matter. Amos arrived at a dead run, dropped to his knees beside them, and one look at the wound told them both everything they needed to know and didn't want to. Hold on, Walt said, gripping Dale's shoulder hard. Hold on, damn you. Tell them, Dale whispered, his voice fading now, softer with every word, tell them I tried. At the end, tell them that. And then his eyes went still, fixed on the wide, dark sky above them, and Walt knelt there in the dirt of his own yard, holding a dying man he had never fully trusted and never fully understood, feeling something complicated and enormous move through his chest, grief and gratitude, and something that felt uncomfortably close to forgiveness, all tangled together in a way that made no simple sense at all. "Rest now," Walt said quietly to a man who could no longer hear him. "You did enough. There was no time to properly mourn." That was the cruelest part of it. Walt buried Dale himself, before dawn, in a quiet corner of the property, digging the grave alone with a shovel that felt heavier than it should have, his mind circling back again and again to the particular tired relief in Dale's voice at the very end, the sound of a man finally setting down something he'd carried too long. He didn't have words for a proper service. Wasn't sure Dale would have wanted one even if he'd had them ready. He simply stood over the freshly turned earth a while, once the work was done, hat in his hands, the same way he stood over Mary and Daniel Stone's on the hill, and said the only thing that felt honest enough to say. "You did one decent thing at the end," Walt said quietly. "Man could do worse than that, I suppose, when it comes down to it." He thought, standing there, about how easy it would have been to simply hate Dale for the months of betrayal, and how that hatred, sitting alongside the grief, felt entirely too small a container for everything he actually felt. Some men were simply more than the worst thing they'd done, and less than the best thing, too. And a man dying in the act of trying to fix his own mistake didn't erase the mistake, but it didn't erase the trying either. Walt wasn't sure yet what to do with a truth that complicated. He supposed he'd carry it a while, the way Nahi's grandmother had said a person carries most things. By full light, he was already gathering everyone: Amos, Kestrel, Talon, Grey Wolf, Otter, and Chogan himself, who arrived within the hour, once word reached him to prepare for a fight that was now coming with absolute certainty, tomorrow night with everything Vane had. "He knew our positions," Walt told him, standing at the center of the group, forcing his voice level though his hands, he noticed, were not quite steady from before. Everything we set up after the last attack, he already knew about before we ever built it. "Then we build something new," Talon said simply. "Something he doesn't know exists." Nahi arrived mid-morning, having ridden ahead of her father once word reached the encampment, and found Walt still standing near the fresh grave, exhaustion carved deep into his face. She didn't offer empty comfort, didn't tell him it would be all right, which he was grateful for, because he wasn't sure either of them would have believed it. "You buried him yourself," she said, taking in the shovel still leaning against the fence post. Seemed right. It was right. She stood beside him a moment, looking at the disturbed earth. "My people believe a death that comes from trying to make something right even too late is not the same as a death that comes from doing wrong. The spirit carries differently." She glanced at him. "I don't know if that comforts you." "It's simply what I believe." "It helps some," Walt admitted. "Good." She was quiet a moment, and then, more gently than he'd heard her speak before, "Tonight will be hard, harder than the last time. I wanted you to know, before it starts, that whatever happens, you did not do this alone. Whatever this valley becomes after tonight, you built something worth defending, and you did not build it by yourself, not this time." Walt looked at her, feeling something in his chest tighten and ease all at once, grief and gratitude tangled together the way they'd been tangled all morning. "Thank you," he said simply, because there wasn't a more complicated way to say it that would have meant more. She reached out briefly and touched his arm, the first time she'd ever done so, and then she was moving off to help Kestrel with the preparations, leaving Walt standing there a moment longer, with the warmth of that brief touch lingering long after her hand was gone. Chogan pulled Walt aside once the preparations were fully underway, his expression graver than Walt had yet seen it. "This will not end with tonight," the old man said. "Whatever happens, win or lose, Vane will not simply accept defeat quietly. Men like him rarely do, I know," Walt said. "Then you should also know this," Chogan continued. "If we hold tonight, the fighting itself may be finished, but the larger matter will not be. Land taken by fraud does not return itself simply because the fraud fails to kill you. You will need more than warriors and rifles to finish this properly." He held Walt's gaze steadily. "You will need truth, laid out where men with the power to act on it cannot look away from it." "You're talking about the law," Walt said. "I am talking about whatever remains of the law once Vane's grip on it is broken," Chogan said. "There are men above Purdy who cannot be bought so easily. Territorial men. If enough truth reaches them, even a corrupt valley cannot hide from it forever. Walt turned that over, understanding for the first time that tonight's fight, however it ended, was only the first half of a longer battle. I hadn't thought that far ahead, he admitted. Few men in the middle of surviving one night think much about the next, Chogan said, something almost gentle in his voice despite the gravity of the conversation. That is why old men are useful to keep around. We have already survived enough nights to start thinking about the ones after. They worked through the day and into the night with an intensity that left no room for anything but the Tassoc itself knew positions, false ones deliberately visible to draw fire, real ones hidden deeper than anything Dale could ever have reported. Chogan sent 2 more riders east with word for reinforcements, though everyone understood there might not be time enough left for them to arrive. When night finally fell, the valley held itself unnaturally still, the way a held breath goes quiet just before it breaks. They came just after midnight. More than before, a dozen riders now, maybe more, moving with none of the earlier hesitation, none of the earlier caution. This time, Walt understood immediately. They had come to kill, not to frighten. The fight that followed was worse than anything the first attack had prepared them for. Gunfire tore through the dark in bursts and silences, horses screaming, men shouting positions, and warnings that dissolved into chaos within the first 60 seconds. Walt fired from the barn loft until his hands ached with the recoil, and beside him somewhere in the dark he could hear Amos doing the same. And further out, the sharp, precise cracks of Talon and Grey Wolf working the ridgeline like they'd been born to it. Time did the strange thing it always did in a fight like this, stretching and compressing at once, so that Walt could never afterward have said whether the whole engagement lasted 10 minutes or an hour. He remembered the muzzle flashes cutting the dark into fragments. He remembered the particular smell of burnt powder thickening the air until it coated the back of his throat. He remembered, with a clarity that would stay with him long after, the sound of a man screaming somewhere near the false position they'd built along the north fence, having walked directly into ground. Talon had deliberately left looking weak in order to funnel the attackers exactly there. A rider broke through near the barn itself at one point, close enough that Walt could see his face in a flash of gunfire young, terrified, clearly less committed to this fight than the men paying him for it, and Walt put a shot wide of him on purpose, close enough to turn him back, without ending a life that didn't need ending tonight. Not every man riding for Vane deserved to die for it, and some part of Walt, even in the middle of all that chaos, still cared about the difference. It was Otter who paid the price. A stray shot in the dark, and the boy went down hard near the south fence, and Kestrel dragged him to cover under a hail of return fire that Walt would remember clearly, for the rest of his life, the particular terror of watching someone else's child bleed on ground you'd sworn to protect. The attackers broke before dawn, finally, driven back by a defense they hadn't expected, positions they'd had no way of anticipating, and the sheer, unbending refusal of every single person in that yard to be moved from ground they had decided together was worth dying for. When the last of the riders finally vanished south into the dark, Walt found himself kneeling in the dirt beside Otter, whose wound, though ugly, had missed anything vital by the narrowest possible margin. The boy would live, would carry a scar for it the way everyone in that yard would carry something out of this night, one way or another. We held, Amos said, appearing out of the smoke and dark, his voice rough with exhaustion and something like disbelief. We held, Walt agreed, but the cost sat heavy in his chest. Dale's grave, still fresh at the edge of the property. Otter's wound, bandaged tight, the boy pale and shaking but alive, and the certain knowledge that Vane, having failed twice now, would not simply give up and go home. They spent the better part of the following morning tending to the aftermath, patching bullet holes in the barn siding, calming horses still skittish from the noise, burying 2 of Vane's men who hadn't survived the fight and whom nobody had the heart to leave for scavengers regardless of which side they'd ridden for. Chogan oversaw that last task personally, insisting on it despite Kestrel's quiet objection that the men had come to kill them the night before. A dead man is no longer an enemy, Chogan said simply. Only a man someone somewhere will grieve. We do not need to add cruelty to a victory that is already costly enough. Walt found himself agreeing with that more readily than he might have expected a year earlier, before any of this had cracked open the careful, closed-off version of himself he'd spent 16 years maintaining. Kindness, he was learning, and cost were not always opposites the way he'd once assumed. Sometimes the harder thing and the right thing turned out to be exactly the same thing, wearing different clothes. It was 3 days after that, while the valley was still stitching itself back together, that a rider came in from the territorial capital, wearing a marshal's badge, carrying a folded document that would change the entire shape of the fight. "Walt Cordell?" the marshal asked, reining in at the gate. "That's me, Marshal Reed. Territorial office." He held out the document, his eyes taking in the bullet-scared barn siding, the fresh grave visible at the edge of the property, with the particular assessing look of a man used to arriving places just after trouble had already passed through. "Judge Whitfield wants to see you. And Silas Vane. Santa Fe, 2 weeks from now. Regarding disputed land claims across this valley." "Word travels fast," Walt said, taking the document. "Word travels fast when 3 separate families file the same complaint against the same man inside of a month," Reed said. "Boone, Hargrove, the Salas widow, all 3 finally willing to put their names to paper, once they heard tell that somebody in this valley was standing up to Vane, instead of just quietly disappearing." He studied Walt a moment longer. "You've stirred something loose here, Cordell, whether you meant to or not. Whole territory's starting to take notice." Walt took the paper. Read it slowly, his heart doing something complicated in his chest, not quite hope, not yet, but something close enough to it that he was almost afraid to name it. "Will the judge actually rule against him?" Walt asked. "Man like Vane usually finds a way around trouble like this." Reed considered the question seriously before answering. "Whitfield's not a man who scares easy, and he's not a man money moves the way it moves most everyone else out here. Won't promise you an outcome. But I'll tell you this much, he doesn't call a hearing like this unless he already believes there's real substance behind the complaints. He wouldn't waste the territory's time otherwise." That was, Walt supposed, about as much reassurance as the moment was likely to offer. Because if there was a way to fight this without another single grave dug on his land, without another young man's blood soaking into ground that had already taken more than its share, it wasn't going to come from a rifle in a barn loft. It was going to come from truth, laid bare, in daylight, in front of a judge who couldn't be bought. That evening, before the preparations for Santa Fe began in earnest, Walt walked up the hill behind the cabin one more time, past the cottonwood tree to the 2 stones sitting quiet in the grass. He hadn't been up since the night of the first attack, and the grass had grown a little wild around the base of the stones in the weeks since, untended amid everything else demanding his attention. He knelt and pulled the worst of it away with his hands, working in silence a while before he finally spoke. "Fight's not over," he told the stones. "Might be starting a new part of it if I'm honest. Courtroom instead of a rifle this time." He paused, turning his hat over in his hands the way he always did up here. "Met someone, Mary. Don't know exactly what to call it yet. But I wanted you to know before I go, in case any of this goes wrong out there. Wanted you to know I'm still here, still trying, still carrying you the way I always have, even with room opening up for something else besides just carrying." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, same as always, offering nothing back but its usual quiet, and Walt found, kneeling there, that the quiet no longer felt like an absence the way it once had. It felt, instead, like a kind of permission, freely given by 2 people who would always be part of him, to keep moving forward into whatever came next. Walt folded the document carefully and looked east, toward the ridge where Chogan's people watched, and toward whatever was still coming. "We'll be there," he said quietly, to no one and everyone at once. And for the first time since Vane had ridden onto his land, with an offer and a threat in the same breath, Walt Cordell allowed himself to believe just barely, just enough to keep moving forward, that this fight might actually be one he could win. Nahi came to see him off the morning he left for Santa Fe, riding in early with Kestrel while Amos finished loading the wagon with what supplies they'd need for the journey. "You'll be careful," she said, not quite a question, standing close enough that Walt could feel the particular warmth of her presence, even in the cool morning air. "Careful as a courtroom allows," Walt said, "which isn't much from what I understand of these things. My father says truth is a different kind of weapon than the ones you're used to carrying." She studied him a moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "He says you'll need patience more than courage for this next part. Says patience is harder for a man who's already proven his courage." "He's not wrong," Walt admitted. Nahi reached out, adjusted the collar of his coat with a small, unnecessary gesture that seemed more about touching him than about the collar itself, and something in the simple domesticity of it caught in Walt's chest unexpectedly. "Come back," she said, quieter now. "Whatever happens in that courtroom. Come back to this valley when it's finished." "I intend to," Walt said. "Got a good reason to these days." Something warm crossed her face at that, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, the morning settling comfortably around the unspoken understanding that had grown, slowly and without much fanfare, into something neither of them was quite ready to name out loud yet, but both of them clearly felt regardless. "Talon and Grey Wolf will stay," Kestrel said, breaking the moment gently. "All business again. Watch the ranch while you're away. Vane may try something while your attention is elsewhere." "Appreciate that," Walt said. "Otter wanted to stay as well," Kestrel added, something fond in his voice. "Insisted his arm was fully healed and he was ready for more responsibility. My father told him healing takes the time it takes, regardless of a young man's impatience to prove himself." Walt smiled at that, despite the gravity of the morning. "Sounds like good advice for more than just a wounded arm." He mounted up a short while later, Amos already settled in the wagon seat, and looked back once toward the ranch, toward Nahi still standing at the gate watching him go, before turning his attention east toward the long road to Santa Fe and whatever waited for him there. The journey took the better part of 3 days, the land changing slowly around them as the valley gave way to open range, and then to the low scattered settlements that eventually thickened into something resembling a real road. Walt spent much of the ride in his own thoughts, turning over everything Chogan had told him about Vane's father, about the water rights, about Mary's family, and a history he'd only just learned he was living inside of. "You're quiet even for you," Amos observed, somewhere on the second day, the wagon wheels grinding steady over hard-packed dirt. "Thinking about Mary's father," Walt admitted. "Man I never met. Fighting a battle I never knew existed until a few weeks back, and here I am finishing it for him, whether I ask for the job or not." "Way I see it," Amos said, "you've been finishing it since the day you married her, whether either of you knew it at the time. Land doesn't forget who fought for it, even when the people holding the deed do." Walt turned that over the rest of the afternoon, watching the country roll past, and found he couldn't entirely disagree. Santa Fe smelled like nothing Walt had smelled in 15 years. Dust, still, because it was still the territory. But under it, leather goods, coffee roasting somewhere, the ink and paper smell that clung to buildings full of law books, a town smell, a civilization smell. Walt had forgotten how much he disliked it. The streets here ran wider than anything back in the valley, lined with adobe buildings that seemed, to Walt's eye, to crowd in on each other in a way that felt almost aggressive after 15 years of open range. Wagons and horses moved in a constant low hum of noise, punctuated by the calls of vendors selling everything from tinware to fresh bread, and Walt found himself missing, almost immediately, the particular quality of silence a man could find 400 acres from his nearest neighbor. He rode in 3 days ahead of the hearing, Amos beside him, Nahi and Kestrel a half-day behind with Chogan, who had insisted on coming himself even though, as Kestrel translated it, careful and a little apologetic, a courtroom in this territory was not built to hear an old man's word as anything more than noise. Amos had said little on the ride out, though Walt had caught him, more than once, checking and rechecking the small satchel of documents Combs had entrusted to him for safekeeping, as though the fate of the entire case rested on his ability to keep a folder of papers from getting rained on or misplaced. "You're more nervous about this than the fighting," Walt observed, somewhere on the second day of travel. "Fighting, a man knows what to do with his hands," Amos said. "This business of judges and papers and lawyers talking circles around plain truth, that's a different animal. Never did trust a fight you couldn't see coming with your own eyes." "Nobody's asking you to trust it," Walt said. "Just to help see it through." "Reckon I can manage that much," Amos said, and returned to his careful inventory of the satchel's contents, checking for the third time that morning that nothing critical had shaken loose during the journey. "He knows the risk," Kestrel had added, before they'd parted ways for the separate legs of the journey. "So some in town will look at him and see only what they've always seen. He comes anyway, 'cause he believes a man should stand near the fight he's helped begin, even if the standings itself accomplishes little beyond his own presence." Walt had understood that instinct completely, having spent enough of his own life standing near fights whose outcomes he couldn't fully control, simply because walking away felt worse than the risk of staying. "They'll listen to Nahi," Walt said the first night, over a fire outside the adobe boarding house that had agreed reluctantly to let their party sleep under its roof. "Won't they?" Kestrel's silence answered before his words did. "They will listen to her," he said finally. "Whether they believe her is a different animal entirely." Walt didn't like that answer, but he understood it, because he'd lived in this country his whole life, and he knew exactly how much weight a courtroom put behind a white man's signature compared to everything else standing in that same room, which was why Ezra Combs mattered so much. The surveyor, independent, out of Santa Fe himself, hired weeks back with money Walt didn't entirely have to spare, to walk every disputed boundary in the valley and put a number of fact, a line on paper, that a judge couldn't wave away as somebody's word against somebody else's. Combs met them the morning before the hearing, older man. Spectacles. Hands stained permanent with ink, the way some men's hands stay stained with grease or dirt. "Your deed," Combs said, spreading documents across a borrowed table, tapping one line with a blunt finger. "This boundary doesn't match the original survey filed 20 years back. Somebody moved it. On paper, at least." "Vain," Walt said. Almost certainly Combs adjusted his spectacles. "But I'd need his documents to prove it plain, and he won't hand those over easy." "What if a judge makes him?" Combs considered that. "That could work," he said slowly. "You'd need real evidence of fraud first, though. Enough to convince a judge it's worth the order." Walt looked at the papers a long moment. Because this was it, wasn't it? This was the whole fight now, boiled down to lines of ink on a page instead of gunfire in a dark yard. Stranger battlefield. No less dangerous, in its own way. "We'll find it," Walt said. He didn't entirely believe himself yet, but he said it anyway, because some things you have to say out loud before you can make them true. Combs stayed a while longer that afternoon, laying out the shape of the coming days for them. Boone had already arrived, he explained, brought back after months hiding out in a neighboring territory, terrified but willing, finally, to put his name to a formal complaint. Hargrove was expected the following morning. The Salas widow had sent word she couldn't make the journey herself, but had provided a sworn statement instead, notarized by a circuit judge she trusted. 3 victims willing to speak plainly, Combs said. That's more than most fraud cases ever managed to gather in this territory. Ought to count for something. Ought to, Walt agreed, though something in his gut told him Vane wouldn't let 3 witnesses simply stand unchallenged, not without a fight of his own. They spent the remainder of that afternoon and much of the evening rehearsing the order of testimony, Combs walking Walt through the particular rhythms of territorial court procedure, explaining which objections a judge like Whitfield tended to entertain and which he dismissed out of hand, which details mattered most to establish first, so that later, more circumstantial evidence would have solid ground to stand on. Walt found the whole process almost as foreign as the courtroom itself, accustomed as he was to fights settled by rifles and clear lines of sight rather than careful sequences of argument. "Feels backward," Walt admitted at one point, spending this much effort deciding which true thing to say first. "Court isn't interested in truth arriving all at once," Combs said. "It's interested in truth arriving in an order a skeptical mind can follow without getting lost. Different discipline than a gunfight, but a discipline all the same." That evening, walking the unfamiliar streets to clear his head before the hearing began, Walt found Nahi sitting alone on the low adobe wall outside the boarding house, looking up at a sky that felt, even here in an unfamiliar town, exactly the same as the one back home. "Can't sleep either," she said, not quite a question, as he settled beside her. "Too much on my mind." "Same," she was quiet a moment. "This is strange country for me. All these buildings pressed so close together. Hard to hear anything the land might be trying to tell you, with so much stone and timber in the way." "Feels the same to me, if I'm honest," Walt admitted. 15 years out on open ground, and towns always did make me feel a little caged. She smiled at that, small in the dark. "Perhaps that's one more thing we have in common, then." They sat together a while longer, not saying much, the particular comfortable silence that had grown between them over the preceding weeks, settling naturally into place even here, far from the valley that had brought them together. Walt found himself sitting there, less afraid of tomorrow's hearing than he'd been an hour earlier, simply for having her steady presence beside him. The courthouse was small, adobe walls that kept the worst of the heat outside, though nothing kept the tension out of the room once both sides had taken their seats. Judge Whitfield presided, 70 years old, white-bearded, a face that had clearly seen every kind of this territory had to offer, and had run out of patience for most of them a long time ago. Vane sat across the aisle with two lawyers in suits too fine for a courtroom this far from anywhere important. Walt sat with Combs, and with Boone, the first of Vane's victims, found and brought back after months in hiding, hands shaking but present. Mr. Boone, Judge Whitfield said, "Tell the court, what happened to your land?" Boone stood. His voice cracked on the first word and steadied only slowly after that. He told it plain: the poisoned well, the threats in the night, the men who came riding through his property until he sold for a fraction of its worth, just to make his family safe again. "And you witnessed these men yourself?" the judge asked. "At your well?" "No, sir." Boone's hands twisted together. "But witnesses from the valley did. Told me the same night. Saw two riders pouring something in." Vane's lawyer was on his feet before the sentence finished. "Objection, Your Honor. Second-hand testimony from unnamed." "I'll decide what carries weight in my courtroom," Whitfield said, cold and flat, and the lawyer sat back down without another word. Hargrove testified next, having arrived that same morning, his account matching Boone's in the broad strokes: pressure, threats, a sale made under duress that no honest man would call willing. He described in halting but steady detail the night riders had cut his fence lines 3 times, a single month, always at the same hour, always vanishing before he could organize any kind of response, until the sheer exhaustion of constant vigilance had worn him down more thoroughly than any single dramatic act of violence could have managed. "Man can only stand watch so many nights running," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who had relived this account many times already in his own mind. "Eventually you sell just to sleep through a night again." Vane understood that better than any man ought to. Understood a slow bleed wears a person down faster than a quick cut sometimes. Judge Whitfield made a note of that, his expression unreadable, and moved on to the Salas widow's notarized statement, read into the record by the court clerk, describing her husband's death and the swift, suspicious sale that followed within 2 weeks of the funeral. Combs went last that first day, laying out the survey discrepancies with the patient precision of a man who had spent his whole career explaining lines on maps to people who didn't much want to understand them. The altered boundary, the dates that didn't match, the signatures that looked under close inspection subtly wrong. "These are forgeries," Combs said, "professional work." "But forgeries all the same." Vane's lawyer objected again, louder this time, and the judge called for a recess to bring in an independent expert from the Territorial Land Office to examine the documents properly. It would take days, everyone understood. Days Walt hadn't quite planned for, sitting in a borrowed room in a town that felt nothing at all like home. It was on the second day of that recess that Vane's lawyers found their opening. They found it in Combs. "Your Honor," the younger of Vane's 2 lawyers said, rising with the particular relish of a man who has just found the exact weapon he was hoping for. "Before this court weighs Mr. Combs's testimony any further, I believe it's relevant that the witness has, in the past, worked directly for my client." The room went very still. "That's a lie," Combs said, half rising from his chair, his face draining pale. "Is it?" The lawyer produced a paper of his own, held it up like a trophy. "A land survey filed in this territory 11 years ago. Signed by an Ezra Whitmore. Same hand, Your Honor. Same particular flourish on the capital E. We had it compared." He let that land. Mr. Whitmore worked for Silas Vane's business partners in a prior venture before he became Mr. Combs. Combs said nothing, which, in a courtroom, sometimes says everything. "Is this true?" Judge Whitfield asked him directly. A long, terrible pause. "It's true," Combs admitted finally, quiet, ashamed. "I changed my name after that venture went bad. I wasn't proud of the work I did back then, Your Honor. I've spent years trying to do better." "Then, Your Honor," Vane's lawyer said, smooth and satisfied, "the court should weigh very carefully whether this man's current testimony against my client is honest correction or old grudge, dressed up as expertise." Walt felt the ground shift under the whole case, right there in that small hot room. Because it didn't matter, really, whether Combs's current work was honest. It only mattered whether a judge could still trust it, once doubt had been planted plain enough to see. The judge called a second recess, longer this time, and Walt walked out of that courthouse into the Santa Fe heat, feeling something close to panic clawing up the back of his throat, because if Combs's word was worthless now, what did they actually have left? Two ranchers and a widow's statement, describing threats and pressure but nothing that could be proven in ink. And nothing that stood out highly to Judd Vane's money and Vane's lawyers and Vane's particular talent for finding the one soft spot in any argument and pressing on it until it broke. He stood a long moment in the shade of the courthouse wall, turning the whole collapsing case over in his mind, feeling the particular helplessness of a man who has fought his way through gunfire and threats and betrayal only to find the final battlefield made of something he understood far less well, paper procedure. The slow grinding machinery of law that didn't respond to courage or conviction the way a fight with rifles did. He'd faced down armed men on his own land and felt more equipped for that than he did for this. He thought, standing there, of every hard thing he'd already survived to reach this point: the war, Mary's death, 16 years of careful solitude, 2 nights of gunfire in his own yard, Dale's dying confession. None of it had broken him. He found himself turning that history over, refusing to believe that a lawyer's clever trick with an old survey document would be the thing that finally did what war and grief and violence had all failed to accomplish. There had to be another way through this. There simply had to be. Combs found Walt outside a short while later, his face still ashen, his hands trembling slightly as he removed and cleaned his spectacles for something to do with them. "I should have told you," Combs said, "about the name, before any of this started. I let my pride get in the way of your case, Cordell, and I'm sorrier for that than I know how to properly say." "Done is done," Walt said, though he couldn't entirely keep the strain out of his voice. "Question now is what we do about it." "I don't know that there's anything left to do," Combs admitted. "Whatever I say from here forward, they'll paint as grudge. Whatever I've already said, they've already tainted." Nahi found him outside, pacing a narrow strip of shade beside the adobe wall. "You look like a man about to be sick," she said. "Feels about right." Walt stopped pacing, made himself stop. "Combs is compromised. Might be enough to sink the whole case. Then we need something else." Nahi said it simply, not a question, a fact, waiting to be solved. "Something else like what?" "Something that isn't a man's word at all." She was quiet a moment, thinking, and then something shifted behind her eyes, a memory surfacing, slow, and then sudden. "Walt, the beadwork. The one my grandmother made you." Walt blinked. "What about it? You still have it?" "Back at the ranch." "Why, because my grandmother didn't just make pretty things," Nahi said, and something in her voice had gone tight, urgent. She was the keeper of boundaries. Water lines. Old markers, from before any of this was ever written on paper by men like Vane. She wove them into her patterns, on purpose, so they couldn't be burned, or stolen or lost the way paper gets lost. A pause. "I think she gave you a map, Walt," without either of us understanding it at the time. Walt felt something cold and electric move up his spine, and with it, a memory surfacing of his own Shogun, weeks back, at the creek bed, mentioning almost in passing that his mother-in-law had made things like that once, things that carried more meaning than they appeared to. He hadn't understood the comment at the time. He understood it now. "We need it here," he said now. Kestrel rode for it that same afternoon, 4 days there, and back if he pushed the horse hard, which meant returning with barely a day to spare before the judge would be ready to rule. Those 4 days were the longest of Walt's life since October of 1871. He spent them in the borrowed boarding house, sitting across from Nahi at a small table, going over every detail Combs had already gathered, looking for anything else that might hold up. If the beadwork turned out to be nothing more than a beautiful gift, and not the evidence Nahi believed it to be. "What if I'm wrong?" Nahi said, the second night, staring at her own hands in the lamplight. "What if it really is just a pattern? And I've sent Kestrel riding 4 days each way chasing a memory that means nothing." "You won't be wrong," Walt said. "You don't know that." "No," Walt admitted. "I don't." He reached across the small table, careful, and covered her hand with his. "But I know you. And I know your grandmother raised you to notice things other people walk right past. I'm willing to bet on that." Nahi looked up at him, something raw and grateful moving across her face. "You bet your whole ranch on a stranger's word once already," she said. "Maybe you just do that. Bet everything on people." "Maybe," Walt said. "Seems to be working out so far." She almost laughed at that. Almost. It was enough. The following night, unable to sleep, despite the exhaustion sitting heavy in both of them, they sat together on the low adobe wall outside the boarding house again, the same spot they'd found comfortable that first evening in town. "I keep thinking about Dale," Walt admitted. surprising himself with the admission. Man spent months betraying me, and the one thing I remember clearest isn't the betrayal. It's him bleeding out in my yard, telling me he wanted to do one decent thing before it was too late. You think about him because he matters to you, Nahi said. Not despite what he did, because of what he tried to undo at the end. Feels strange to grieve a man like that. Grief doesn't ask permission for who it attaches to, Nahi said. My grandmother grieved people who'd wronged her plenty in her life. Said the wronging and the grieving were separate rooms in the same house, and a person couldn't always choose which room they woke up in on a given morning. Walt turned that over, feeling something in his chest ease slightly at the permission implicit in her words. Your grandmother sounds like she had wisdom enough for 3 lifetimes. She did. Nahi's voice went soft, fond. I only hope I'm managing to carry even a portion of it forward properly. Seems to me you're managing just fine, Walt said, and meant it entirely. They passed the third night much the same way, though the conversation drifted, eventually, away from the case entirely, into quieter territory. Neither of them had made much space, for amid all the preparation and danger of recent weeks. What happens, Nahi asked, if we win this? If Vane loses everything and leaves the territory for good? What does a rancher do with a life that isn't spent fighting for it anymore? Walt considered the question seriously, surprised by how unfamiliar the shape of it felt. Don't rightly know, he admitted. Been so long since I thought past simply surviving the next season. I'm not sure I remember how to think past it. Perhaps you'll have to learn, Nahi said, something gentle in her voice. The way you learn to listen to the land again. One small piece at a time. Might need a teacher for that too, Walt said, and the look she gave him in response, warm and a little shy, despite everything they'd already weathered together, stayed with him long after the lamp had finally been put out for the night. Kestrel rode back in on the evening of the 4th day, exhausted, his horse lathered and blowing hard, the bundle of hide clutched against his chest the exact same way Nahi had once clutched it running for her life on a dusty trail that felt, now, like it belonged to some entirely different lifetime. They spread the beadwork out on the table under lamplight. Walt, Nahi, Kestrel, and Combs, who had insisted on being present despite everything, because whatever else was true about the man, he cared genuinely about getting this one thing right. Nahi's fingers traced the border pattern slowly, murmuring something under her breath, translating not words this time but symbols, the particular language her grandmother had woven, bead by bead, into something that looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like simple decoration. Here, she said finally, tapping a cluster of blue beads set slightly apart from the rest. This is the eastern branch of the creek. And here her finger moved along a line of white. This is the old boundary, before anyone changed it on paper. She looked up, eyes bright with something between grief and triumph. It doesn't match Vane's current deed at all. Walt? Not even close. She continued working through the pattern methodically, identifying a small cluster of red beads as marking the location of a spring that had, according to her explanation, run dry decades earlier, but which the old boundary lines had still been drawn to account for, and a subtle shift in bead density along one edge that indicated where the original survey had been altered most dramatically. It was, Combs observed quietly, watching her work more precise in its way than many official surveys he'd examined over the years, simply rendered in a medium the territorial courts had never once thought to consider as evidence. Your grandmother trained you well, Combs said. This kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. She trained me because she believed paper burns and beads survive, Nahi said. She had seen enough of what men like Vane's father were capable of even in her own lifetime to understand that the truth needed to be kept somewhere. Fire and greed couldn't easily reach it. Combs leaned in, adjusting his spectacles, studying the pattern with the same careful attention he gave any official survey. He was quiet a long moment. This is remarkable, he said finally, quiet with something like awe. This predates every document in that courtroom, and it doesn't come from my hand, or my name, or my history at all. He looked up at Walt. Nobody can attack this evidence by attacking me, because I have nothing to do with where it came from. Walt felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in days. Will the judge accept it, he asked. He'll have to hear it, at least, Combs said. Whether Nahi presents it herself? Naha's chin lifted at that, steady. Certain. I'll present it, she said. Myself. They spent what remained of the evening preparing exactly how she would do it, Combs offering guidance on the particular formal language courts responded to, Kestrel translating certain technical terms into concepts Nye could weave naturally into her explanation of the pattern's meaning. By the time they finally turned in for the night, something like real hope had settled over the small room, fragile but present. The first genuine hope Walt had felt since the credibility attack 2 days earlier. They never got the chance to plan exactly how the next crisis would unfold. It happened the night before the hearing was set to resume. The night everyone should have been resting, gathering whatever nerve they had left for the morning ahead. Walt woke to Kestrel's voice outside his window, low and urgent, and the particular cold clarity that comes when a man's body understands danger a full second before his mind catches up. "Nahi's gone," Kestrel said, the moment Walt opened the door. Her room, empty, window forced from outside. Walt's blood went to ice. "Vain," he said, "not a question." "Has to be." Kestrel's jaw was tight, his hands not quite steady. "He knows what tomorrow means for him. If she testifies with that map, then he loses everything," Walt finished. "And a man who's already lost everything doesn't play by any rules left." They found the note 20 minutes later, tucked under Walt's own door, unsigned, because it didn't need a signature for anyone in that room to know exactly whose hand had written it. "Drop the case, or you'll bury her the way you buried your first wife." Walt read it twice. Something in him went very still, not calm. Exactly. Something past calm. Something that had gone quiet the way a man goes quiet right before he does something he can never take back. Word reached Otter, and the rest of the small camp Talon and Gray Wolf had kept near the courthouse, before Walt himself had finished saddling his horse. Otter arrived at a dead run, face pale, weapon already in hand, the careful discipline he'd learned over recent months visibly straining against raw fury. "Let me ride," Otter said. "Please. I've earned that much." "You've earned it," Walt agreed. "But someone needs to stay ready here, in case this goes wrong, and word needs carrying fast to Chogan and the judge both. Can't spare a man for speed and a man for the fight both. Not with the numbers we've got." Otter's jaw tightened, the disappointment plain on his young face, but he nodded, understanding the necessity even as it cost him something to accept it. "Bring her back," he said, echoing, without knowing it, almost the exact words Chogan himself would speak moments later. He stood there a moment longer than the situation strictly allowed, feeling the old cavalry discipline war against every instinct screaming at him to simply ride, now as fast as his horse could carry him, toward wherever Nahi had been taken. He had learned 4 years and a lifetime ago that the men who survived engagements were rarely the ones who moved fastest. They were the ones who moved smartest, even when every fiber of themselves demanded otherwise. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to think. "Amos," he said, "get the horses." Walt Amos started. Now, something in Walt's voice must have carried the full weight of what he wasn't saying, because Amos didn't argue further, simply moved to comply, and within minutes the small party had assembled in the dark street outside the boarding house, grim and silent and ready. They rode with the hour, Walt, Amos, Kestrel, Talon, Gray Wolf, and Combs staying behind reluctantly to hold their position at the courthouse in case, God willing, this ended in time for the hearing to matter at all. Chogan wanted to ride too, and it took every ounce of Kestrel's persuasion and Walt's own careful, desperate argument to convince the old man that his best use tonight was not on a horse but standing ready to speak, if speaking was still possible, to whatever authority might listen once this was over. "My daughter," Chogan said, his composure cracking for just a moment, the first time Walt had ever seen the old man's steady control genuinely falter. "Bring her back to me, Cordell, whatever it costs." "I intend to," Walt said. And something passed between the two men in that moment that went beyond alliance, beyond the careful negotiated partnership they'd built over recent weeks. Something closer to the understanding between two fathers, one who had lost a child already, and one who could not bear to lose another person he'd come to love in her place. They tracked the trail south through the dark, the moon offering just enough pale light to work by, Talon reading sign that Walt would never have found on his own, a broken branch here, a hoofed print pressed deep with the weight of 2 riders on one horse there until, well past midnight, they found the place. An old line shack, half collapsed, tucked into a fold of land 2 hours outside town. Firelight flickered weak through a gap in the boards. Walt's whole body wanted to charge that door. Every instinct from every dark night of this fight screamed at him to move now, fast, before another second passed with Nahi inside those walls. Except charging in blind gets people killed, said the part of him that had survived 4 years of war doing exactly this kind of work. And that part of him, cold and clear and useful, was the part he needed most right now. Positions, he whispered instead, forcing the word out steady even though nothing in him felt steady at all. Talon, the back. Grey Wolf, the window on the south side. Amos, with me, front door. They moved into the dark like water, finding its way downhill, quiet, patient, deliberate. Through the gap in the boards, Walt could see her. Nahi, hands bound, sitting straight-backed against the far wall, with a defiance in her posture that made something in his chest ache, with pride even in the middle of all this fear. And Vane, pacing, two of his men flanking the door, rifles loose in their hands but not yet raised. "You think this saves you?" Nahi said, her voice carrying clear through the gap, steady despite everything. "It doesn't. The map is already in Santa Fe. Whatever you do to me tonight, it changes nothing tomorrow. It changes everything," Vane snapped. "Because without you standing up in that courtroom, it's just a piece of beadwork nobody can properly explain." "Then you don't know my people very well," Nahi said. "Someone else will explain it. Someone always will." Vane stopped his pacing, studied her a long moment with something almost like genuine curiosity beneath the fury. "You're not afraid," he said. "Even now." "I'm afraid," Nahi said plainly. "Fear and surrender are not the same thing, whatever you've convinced yourself of over the years. You know nothing about what I've convinced myself of. I know you lost a son." Nahi, now, though no less steady, Chogan told Cordell everything. "I know you've spent years chasing a piece of ground you believe will undo that loss. It won't. It never could. My people have watched white men chase that particular ghost across this territory for generations, and not one of them has ever caught it, because it was never actually running in the direction they thought." Something flickered across Vane's face in the lamplight, raw and unguarded for just a moment before the familiar hardness reasserted itself. "You don't get to speak about my son," he said, low and dangerous. "Then stop trying to bury your grief under my people's land," Nahi said. "It was never going to fit there. Some things simply don't fit, no matter how hard a man forces the ground to hold them." Vane's hand cracked across her face before Walt's brain had even finished processing the threat in his voice. That sound flat, sudden, ugly was the last thing Walt needed to hear before every careful patient soldier's instinct in him gave way entirely to something older and rawer and far less controlled. He was through the door before Amos could stop him. The next several seconds moved in fragments, the way violence always does, flashes, rather than a clean sequence. A shot fired wide, splintering wood above Walt's head. Amos's rifle answering it from the doorway. Talon crashing through the back wall in a shower of rotten boards, moving on the second guard before the man had even fully turned. Grey Wolf's shape at the window, and then his voice, sharp with pain, as a shot meant for Walt caught him instead, low in the shoulder, and he went down hard but kept firing, kept covering, because that was simply what Grey Wolf did. One of Vane's men lunged for Walt from the side, and Walt met him with the flat, cold efficiency the war had trained into him decades earlier, a training he'd hoped never to need again and was grateful, in that single desperate moment, to still possess. The man went down and stayed down, and Walt didn't spare him a second thought. His entire focus narrowed to the single overturned table where Nahi still sat, bound, watching the chaos unfold around her with a composure that struck him even in the heat of the moment. Walt reached Nahi in 3 strides, cutting her bonds with a knife his hands, somehow, miraculously held steady enough to use. "Down," he said, pulling her behind the overturned table just as another shot cracked through the small room. "Stay down." Vane was scrambling for the back door, his composure entirely gone now. Nothing left of the smooth, dangerous man from the corral except pure animal panic. "Vane." Walt's voice cut through the chaos, hard as anything he'd ever said in his life. "It's over." Vane turned, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that might, in a better man, have been shame. In Vane, it looked only like calculation running out of options. "You'll hang for this," Vane spat. "Breaking into my property, assaulting your property," Amos said flatly, stepping into the doorway behind Walt, rifle steady. "This shack's not even on your deed, Vane. Checked the survey myself 3 days back. Funny thing about that." Something in Vane's face finally broke entirely at the last thread of his careful, constructed authority simply giving way. He looked, in that final unguarded moment, less like the dangerous land baron who had terrorized this valley for 3 years, and more like exactly what Chogan had described weeks earlier at the creek bed, a man consumed so completely and a private grief that he had never once, in all the years of chasing it, stopped to notice how thoroughly it had hollowed him out in the process. It was over in another minute. Talon had the second guard bound and disarmed. Grey Wolf, wounded but conscious, was already being tended by Kestrel with the particular calm efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work before and would do it again if he had to. And Vane himself, stripped of every advantage he'd spent 3 years building in this valley, stood in the middle of that collapsing shack with his hands finally, for the first time, raised. Walt knelt beside Nahi, checking her over with hands that had finally, mercifully, stopped shaking quite so badly. "You came," she said, quiet, something breaking open in her voice that hadn't been there even in the worst of it. "Course I came," Walt said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to, thick with everything he hadn't said yet and wasn't sure how to say now. "Told you once already. I bet everything on people." She almost laughed. Then she was crying instead, and he pulled her in close, and for one long moment neither one of them said anything at all, because nothing needed saying that this simply wasn't already saying on its own. They rode back into Santa Fe just past dawn, Vane bound and silent between two guards. Marshal Reed had ridden out personally to collect once word reached him because word, it turned out, traveled fast in a town small enough that a land baron's sudden, desperate crime against a federal witness. The night before, a major hearing was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet for long. Walt found himself unexpectedly shaken in the hours following the fight, in a way he hadn't quite anticipated. He'd faced gunfire before, on his own land, twice now in recent weeks, and had managed each time to hold the old soldier's discipline steady enough to function. But something about the particular violence of the shack, the confined space, the sound of Vane's hand against Nahi's face, the raw animal fear of nearly losing her, had cracked something loose in him that the earlier fights hadn't quite managed to touch. "You're shaking," Nahi observed quietly, once they'd made camp for what remained of the night before the final ride back into town. "Didn't notice," Walt admitted, looking down at his own hands with something like surprise. "It's all right to shake," Nahi said. "My grandmother used to say the body keeps its own accounting of fear, separate from whatever the mind decides to believe about courage. It settles its debts eventually in its own time, whether a person gives it permission or not." Walt sat with that a while, watching his hands slowly steady in the firelight, and found some measure of peace in simply not fighting the tremor, letting it run its course, the way Nahi's grandmother apparently would have advised. Grey Wolf's wound, tended properly now by a real doctor, would heal clean, though he'd carry the scar the rest of his life, one more mark on a body that had already given plenty to this fight, and given it, Walt understood now with complete clarity, entirely out of loyalty to a stranger who had, months back, simply held out the reins of his only horse and asked for nothing in return. Talon sat with Grey Wolf through much of that morning while the doctor worked, and Walt found the two of them afterward sharing a rare joke, low and dry, about how a man who claimed to understand horses better than people had nonetheless managed to get himself shot protecting one anyway. "Wasn't protecting the horse," Grey Wolf said, wincing as he shifted position. "Girl matters more than any horse, even a good one." "Careful," Talon said, mock serious. "That's the kind of talk that gets a man teased for the rest of his life." "Only if he lives long enough for the teasing," Grey Wolf said, and even Walt, exhausted and raw from the night's events, found himself laughing quietly at that, grateful beyond measure that the moment allowed for laughter at all. The hearing resumed 2 days later, delayed just long enough for the dust literal and otherwise to settle. Nahi stood before Judge Whitfield with the beadwork spread across a small table and told the court in her own steady voice the story her grandmother had told her, the language of boundaries woven into pattern, the water lines marked in blue and white, long before any surveyor's ink had ever touched this valley's paper. Combs, present despite his own compromised credibility, could only confirm what any trained eye could see once it was pointed out plain, that the pattern, whatever its origin, precisely matched water rights and boundary lines that predated Vane's altered deeds by decades. "Your Honor," Vane's lawyer tried, weaker now, the fight visibly draining out of the argument even as he made it. "A piece of a needlework cannot possibly be considered legal evidence in a—" "Sit down, counselor," Judge Whitfield said, and something in his voice this time carried real finality. "I've heard testimony in this courtroom for 40 years. I know truth when it's finally standing plain in front of me." He looked at Vane directly, and whatever remained of the man's composure withered entirely under that gaze. "And I've also just received a federal marshal's report regarding an assault and abduction committed by you personally 2 nights ago, which, Mr. Vane, rather settles any remaining questions I might have had about your character." The verdict, when it came a day later, was thorough. Every acre taken through fraud from Boone, from Hargrove, from the Salas widow ordered returned. Restitution, ordered paid. Vane banned from purchasing land anywhere in the territory. For 20 years, his name entered into federal record as a warning to any future venture he might try elsewhere. And Sheriff Purdy, once Marshal Reed's report on the family connection reached the appropriate ears, stripped of his badge entirely, his particular brand of bought justice finally, completely, at an end. Purdy's removal happened quietly, without ceremony, a territorial deputy simply arriving one afternoon to collect the badge and deliver formal notice, though word of it spread through the valley within a single day regardless. Walt heard, secondhand, that Purdy had left the territory entirely within the week, unwilling to face a community that had enforced Vane's will for 2 years under the thin pretense of impartial law. Nobody in the valley seemed particularly sorry to see him go. Word of the verdict itself reached the valley ahead of Walt's own return, carried by riders eager to be first with the news, and by the time his party finally crossed back onto familiar ground, something had visibly shifted in the atmosphere of every small settlement they passed through. Shopkeepers who had once looked the other way when Vane's men rode through now spoke openly about the trial, about the beadwork evidence that had apparently become something of a local legend already, exaggerated with each retelling. A boy of perhaps 10 ran alongside Walt's horse for a stretch outside the trading post, asking eager questions about whether it was true that an old piece of Indian needlework had beaten one of the richest men in the territory in a court of law. "Something like that," Walt told him, unable to keep a small smile from his face despite the exhaustion of the journey. Vane said nothing as the verdict was read. Nothing at all. He simply stood, hands still bound, and looked once, briefly, at Walt and Nahi sitting together across the courtroom, a look that carried hatred, plainly, but also something smaller and sadder underneath it, the look of a man who had spent 2 generations, his father's and his own, chasing a victory that could never actually undo the grief that had driven him to seek it in the first place, and who had just been shown, in the plainest possible terms, exactly how completely the chase had failed him. For just a moment, as the marshals moved to lead him away, Vane's eyes found Walt's again, and something passed between them that Walt would turn over for a long while afterward, not quite an apology, because Vane seemed constitutionally incapable of offering one, but something adjacent to it. A brief, wordless acknowledgement that the two of them had both lost people they loved, had both spent years since carrying that loss in vastly different directions, and that only one of those directions had led anywhere worth arriving at. "You had a wife who stayed," Vane said quietly, almost to himself, as the marshals turned him toward the door. "A whole valley willing to fight beside you. I had money, and it bought me nothing that mattered in the end." Walt didn't have an answer for that. Wasn't sure one existed that would have reached a man so thoroughly consumed by his own inherited grief. He simply watched Vane go, feeling something complicated settle into his chest. Alongside the relief and triumph, he'd expected to feel more purely a kind of sorrow, distant but genuine, for a man who might have chosen an entirely different life, and had instead spent both his father's years and his own chasing a ghost that could never once have been caught. Then the marshals let him out, and it was at last finished. Boone found Walt outside the courthouse afterward, gripping his hand with both of his own, unable to fully articulate his gratitude beyond a few halting words about his family finally having a home to return to. Hargrove said much the same. Even Combs, still visibly ashamed of how nearly his own past had sunk the whole case, thanked Walt quietly for not abandoning him once the truth of his old name had come out. "Man deserves a second chance to do right by his mistakes," Walt told him. "Learned that lesson myself recently. Cost me something to learn it. Glad it wasn't wasted." Combs seemed to turn that over a long moment, something settling in his expression that looked almost like relief. "I'll be staying in the territory a while longer, I think," he said. "There's more surveying work needed now, with 3 ranches changing hands back to their rightful owners. Seems fitting, somehow." that the work which nearly undid me ends up being the work that helps put things right instead. What happened to the old name, Walt asked, curious despite himself. Ezra Whitmore. Ever think about going back to it, now that the worst of it's out in the open anyway? Combs considered the question seriously. Thought about it plenty, he admitted. But I've come to believe a man's name matters less than what he does with the years he's got left to carry it. Whitmore did wrong. Combs has spent a decade trying to do right. Seems more honest to let both truths sit inside the one name, rather than pretending a new one erases what came before it. He offered a small, tired smile. Your friend Chogan's people might understand that better than most of us do. A person carrying their whole history forward, the good and the shameful both, rather than cutting pieces away to make the story simpler. Reckon they might, Walt agreed, thinking of Vane, of Dale, of his own 16 years' careful hiding and finding, in Combs's words, something that applied rather more broadly than the man had perhaps intended. Marshall Reed found Walt as well, before the party finally began the long ride home, offering a rare handshake and an even rarer compliment. Territory needs more men willing to stand up the way you did, Cordell, he said. Most folks just keep their heads down and hope trouble passes them by. Doesn't always work out that way, but it's the easier bet, and most men take the easier bet. Didn't feel like much of a choice, by the time it mattered, Walt admitted. Best choices rarely do, Reed said, and rode off to attend to whatever other business the territory required of him. The ride home took the same 3 days it had taken to arrive. Though the journey felt entirely different, traveled in the other direction, the weight of uncertainty replaced by something lighter, more settled. Walt found himself watching the familiar country roll past, thinking less about what had been lost along the way, and more about what remained standing at the end of it, a valley free of Vane's shadow, 3 families with homes to return to, and a woman riding beside him who had, somewhere in the span of a few short months, become as essential to his sense of the world as the land itself. Feels strange, Nahi said, somewhere on the second day of the return journey, riding toward home instead of away from danger, for once. Good strange, I hope, Walt said. Good strange, she confirmed, something soft in her voice. I could get accustomed to this particular kind of strange, given enough practice. They crossed back onto the valley's familiar ground on the 3rd afternoon, the eastern ridge rising up ahead of them exactly as it always had, and Walt felt something settle fully into place in his chest, for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun on that dusty trail months earlier. 6 months later, Walt stood on his porch at dawn, coffee in hand, watching the sun climb the eastern ridge, the way it had climbed every single morning of his life on this land. But everything about the watching had changed. Boone had reclaimed his land, was rebuilding his barn with help from half the valley ranchers and Chogan's people alike, working side by side in a way that would have seemed impossible a year ago, and now seemed, simply, like the only sensible way to have ever done things. Hargrove was back too, and the Salas widow, and the whole valley had settled into something Walt hadn't felt in this place in 16 long years. Peace. Real peace. Not the hollow, careful silence he'd built his whole life around instead. Something warmer than that. Something earned. The valley had changed in ways large and small over those 6 months. A trading arrangement had grown up naturally between the ranchers and Chogan's people. Cattle and horses exchanged for goods and knowledge in a rhythm that benefited everyone involved. Something that would have seemed unthinkable to most of the valley's white residents a year earlier, and now drew barely a comment from anyone. Sheriff Purdy's replacement, a quiet, careful man named Osgood sent out from the territorial capital, had made a point of visiting Chogan personally within his first month in office, an act of simple respect that had done more to rebuild trust than any number of official proclamations might have managed. Otter had grown taller that summer, or perhaps simply carried himself taller, the particular confidence of a young man who had proven himself in a fight and come through it changed but not diminished. He rode out to the ranch regularly now, ostensibly to help with the cattle, though Walt suspected at least part of the draw was simple friendship, the kind that had grown unplanned between people who had bled a little for the same cause. Grey Wolf says I've got a decent eye for a lame horse now, Otter told Walt proudly, one afternoon in early autumn, examining a gelding's hoof with a careful attention that would have done Grey Wolf himself proud. He's not wrong, Walt said, watching the boy work. You've come a long way since that first day you all rode in here. Feels like a different life, Otter admitted. Before all this happened. Simpler, maybe. but I don't know that I'd trade it back given the choice. Talon and Grey Wolf had both settled into an easy, informal role as something between neighbors and family, drifting between the ranch and Chogan's encampment, with the loose, comfortable rhythm of men who had earned the right to move freely between two worlds that had once, not so long ago, regarded each other with deep and understandable suspicion. Grey Wolf's shoulder had healed clean, exactly as the doctor promised, though he still favored it slightly on cold mornings. A small, permanent reminder of the price loyalty had cost him. Amos, for his part, had taken to the changed rhythm of the ranch with his usual quiet steadiness, though Walt caught him, more than once, watching Nahi and Walt together with an expression that looked almost paternally pleased, as close to open sentiment as the older man ever allowed himself. "Never thought I'd see it," Amos admitted one evening, the two of them sharing a quiet drink, on the porch after a long day's work. "Man I've known 15 years, closed up tighter than a bank vault, finding his way back open again. Wasn't sure I'd see it myself," Walt said honestly. "Mary would be glad of it," Amos said, quiet, careful, the way he approached most subjects that mattered. "Never met the woman myself, but I've heard enough about her over the years to know that much for certain. She wasn't the kind of person who'd have wanted you spending the rest of your life alone in her memory." Walt turned that over, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere warm in his chest. "No," he agreed. "Reckon she wouldn't have." Kestrel visited less frequently now that the immediate danger had passed, his responsibilities within his own community pulling him in other directions, though he made a point of riding out at least once a month, and Walt had come to genuinely look forward to those visits. The easy conversation of a man who had become, somewhere along the way, something closer to a true friend than a mere ally. Chogan himself rode out that same autumn, alone without Kestrel to translate, his English proving more than sufficient for the quiet conversation that followed on Walt's porch, as the light went long and gold across the valley they had both fought to protect. "I did not expect, the day my daughter came running across your fence line, that it would end here," Chogan admitted, watching the same sunset Walt had watched 1,000 times before. A white rancher's porch. My daughter's laughter drifting from inside his house. A peace between our peoples that has held now for half a year, longer than I dared hope for when we first spoke at the dry creek. "Didn't expect it myself," Walt said honestly. "Few good things announce themselves in advance," Chogan said. "That has been my experience across 60 years of living. The best of what comes to a person usually arrives disguised as trouble first, and only reveals its true shape once a person has already committed to seeing it through." He was quiet a moment, something contemplative in his weathered face. "You handed my daughter a horse and asked for nothing. I have thought many times since about what might have happened, had you asked something in return, however small. I do not believe any of what followed would have been possible." "Wasn't thinking about return at the time," Walt said. "Wasn't thinking much of anything, if I'm honest. Just acted." "That is precisely why it mattered," Chogan said. "A kindness offered with calculation attached is a transaction. A kindness offered without it is something closer to what my people would call medicine. It heals in ways a person cannot always predict or control." He rose, preparing to leave as the light finally faded toward evening. "I am glad, Cordell, that the medicine you offered that day found its way back to you as well, in whatever form it needed to take to reach you." Walt watched him ride east into the gathering dusk, feeling the weight and warmth of the old man's words settle into him long after he'd disappeared over the ridge. "My people speak of you differently now," Kestrel told him, on one such visit, sharing coffee on the same porch where their partnership had first properly begun. "Not as the white rancher who happened to need our help. As Cordell, who stood beside us when standing cost him something real." "Couldn't have done any of it without your people standing beside me first," Walt said. "That's precisely why they speak of you the way they do," Kestrel said, something like quiet satisfaction in his voice. "A debt repaid honestly changes how two people see each other, permanently, for the better. My father understood that the very first day you handed Nahi your only horse. Took the rest of us a little longer to fully believe it. Walt had made good, that same summer, on the promise he'd offered Nahi weeks before the trial, riding out to examine Chogan's struggling herd with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his whole life reading cattle the way other men read faces. He'd found the trouble within a single afternoon, a mineral deficiency in the grazing ground on the herd's usual summer range that no one had thought to look for, easily enough remedied once identified. and Chogan's calf losses had dropped to nearly nothing by autumn. A rancher's eye finds what a hunter's eye walks past. Chogan told him afterward, genuine gratitude warming his usually measured voice. I am glad now that my daughter thought to offer you the chance to look. Glad to have been useful, Walt said, and meant it fully. The particular satisfaction of reciprocated kindness settling into him more deeply than he might once have expected. In turn, Nahi had continued teaching him, patient and thorough, long after the danger that first brought them together had passed. That same autumn, she showed him how to read the particular quality of birdsong that signaled a change in weather coming faster than any cloud on the horizon might suggest, and how to find water in country that looked, to an untrained eye, entirely dry. You're a quick study, for a man who spent 15 years not listening, she told him one afternoon, watching him correctly identify a water source by nothing more than the pattern of insects gathering near a particular stand of grass. Had a good teacher, Walt said. Patient one, too. Lord knows I needed the patience. You needed exactly the amount I had to give, Nahi said, something warm and teasing in her voice. Not a bit less, and not a bit more. Footsteps came up behind him on the porch boards, soft and familiar now in a way that still, every single time, made something in his chest lift. Nahi came to stand beside him, her shoulder against his, and together they watched the light climb gold, then white, then that particular hard brightness that used to make him squint away from everything, and now somehow watched. Beautiful morning, she said. Yeah, Walt agreed, quiet. It really is. They stood there a long while in comfortable silence. 3 months back, she'd asked him a question he still turned over sometimes in his mind, what he wanted now, with Vane gone, with the land safe, with nothing left standing between him and whatever came next. And Walt had answered honestly, the way he'd learned, slowly, painfully, to answer most things now. He'd told her he wanted her, not just as the woman who'd taught him to listen to the land again. Something more than that. She'd talked to her father, talked harder still, to her own heart. And she'd told him, in the end, not marriage, not yet, because both of them still had healing left to do, still had ground of their own to walk, before they were ready for that particular kind of forever. But yes to trying. Yes to seeing where this went. Yes to being together, one ordinary morning at a time, and that, Walt had discovered, was more than enough. Earlier that same week, they'd walked together up the hill behind the cabin, past the cottonwood tree, to visit Mary and Daniel Stone's, something Walt had never once done with anyone else present in all the years since the burial. Nahi had stood quietly a respectful distance back at first until Walt, surprising himself, had asked her to come closer. I want you to know them, he'd said, even if only through stone and grass. Feels wrong somehow, building something new with you, without you ever knowing they were here first. Nahi had knelt at the base of the stones, read the names silently, and then said something in her own language, soft and unhurried, before translating it for him. "A blessing my grandmother taught me, for those who came before, so the ones who come after can walk forward without fear of forgetting them." She'd looked up at him. I don't take their place, Walt. I only walk alongside where they once stood. Something in Walt had come fully undone at that, gently, without pain, and he'd knelt beside her at the stones and wept, for the first time in 16 years, without the crushing weight that grief had always carried before, and Nahi had simply stayed beside him, her hand in his, until the weeping had run its course, and something lighter had settled into its place. They'd stayed up there a long while afterward, past the point where either of them had anything more to say, simply sitting together in the grass with the valley spread out below them, gold and green, and finally at peace. Walt found himself, in that quiet, thinking not of loss but of continuation, the way a river kept moving, even after the particular water that had once filled it had long since passed on downstream, the way land held the memory of everyone who had ever loved it without ceasing, on that account, to welcome whoever came to love it next. Daniel would have been 16 this year, Walt said eventually, the number surfacing unbidden, the way such numbers sometimes did. Strange to think on. Man I never got to know, aging in my mind, same as if he'd lived. He is part of this valley regardless, Nahi said gently. Every place holds the people who might have been, alongside the people who were. That is not a sad thing, Walt, though I understand why it might feel that way at first. It only means the land remembers more fully than any one person could manage alone. Walt turned that over, and found to his quiet surprise that it eased something in him rather than deepening the old ache. He thought he understood, finally sitting there with her in the fading afternoon light, what she had meant weeks earlier, about walking alongside rather than replacing. Grief and love, it seemed, were not opposites competing for the same limited space in a person's chest. They were, more truthfully, old companions who had learned, over enough time and enough patience, how to sit quietly side by side. "I love you," he said now on the porch, simple, true, the words coming easier every time he said them, though they'd still felt impossible once, not so very long ago. Nahi turned to him, that smile crossing her face, the one that still every time undid something old and stubborn behind his ribs. Then softer, "I love you too." She leaned up, kissed him, brief and warm, and Walt Cordell, 43 years old, 16 years alone, a man who had spent a decade and a half convinced he would never again feel anything worth the risk of feeling it felt, standing there in the gold morning light, absolutely everything at once. Joy, gratitude, something that might, if he let it, simply be called hope. Inside the cabin, on the small table by the window, Mary's photograph still sat exactly where it always had. Blue dress, steady eyes. Walt still looked at it every morning now, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to for 16 long years. Beside it, the beadwork Nahi's grandmother had made the gift that turned out to carry, hidden in its careful pattern, far more than either of them had ever guessed. Two loves, two different chapters of the same long, aching life. Neither one erasing the other. Both of them, somehow, finding room to exist together in the same small cabin on the same hard-won land. "Thank you," Walt murmured against her hair. "For what?" Nahi asked. "For noticing," he said. "That first day. The horseshoe. All of it since." Nahi laughed, then soft warm, a finally finding its way over stone after a long dry season. "Always," she said. "I will always notice." And Walt understood, standing there with the whole valley waking gold and green around them, that she wasn't only talking about horseshoes anymore. She was talking about him. All of him, the broken parts that would never fully mend, the healing parts still finding their shape, the parts of him that had spent 16 years invisible and had learned, finally, the hard way, that invisible had never once meant safe. He thought back, standing there, to the man he'd been that first morning on the fence line, kneeling in the dust with pliers in his hand, certain that a life spent needing nothing, and no one was the only safe way left to live it. That man had been wrong. He understood now, in nearly every particular that mattered. Safety had never come from need itself being absent. It had come, all along, from having people worth the risk of needing, and being needed by them in return. Danger had found him anyway in the end, but so had everything else worth having. Community, alliance, a love he'd never once expected to find twice in one lifetime. Mary had told him something once. In a moment he'd spent 16 years trying and failing to fully remember, something whispered, near the very end, that his own grief had made too loud to hear clearly at the time. "Keep living," she'd said. He understood it now, standing on this porch, in this light, with this woman beside him. Understood that she hadn't meant it as a simple instruction to continue breathing, continue working, continue existing, in the narrow, careful way he'd managed for 16 years. She had meant something larger, something he'd only fully grasped in the months since a girl ran across his fence line with a hide bundle clutched to her chest. Living meant risk. Meant opening doors a frightened heart preferred to keep bolted. Meant trusting strangers, and warriors, and old headmen, and eventually, himself, with the possibility that good things could still find their way to a man who had long since stopped believing he deserved them. He thought of Dale, buried at the edge of the property, a man who had spent months betraying him and had died trying, however imperfectly, to undo it. He thought of Otter's scar, and Grey Wolf's healed shoulder, and Combs's borrowed name finally worn honestly. He thought of Chogan's steady hand at the creek bed, and Kestrel's careful English, and the particular blue and white beadwork that it turned out to hold, hidden in its careful pattern, more truth than any single document in that Santa Fe courtroom. All of it, every piece, had led here. To this porch, this light, this woman who had noticed a loose horseshoe while running for her life, and had never once, in all the months since, stopped noticing the things that mattered most. Keep living. And so, finally, after 16 long years, Walt Cordell did.